It is still dark when the pilots walk to their aircraft. Not a word is spoken. The Pacific air smells of salt and engine oil, and somewhere beneath all of that, something else, the particular quiet that only exists before the world changes. These men are not going on a patrol. They are going to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. And the machine they are climbing into, a slender, silver aircraft with an open cockpit and elliptical wings, will do something that almost no weapon in the history of modern war had managed to do. It will be completely, overwhelmingly dismissed by its enemies, right up until the moment it destroys them. You are about to spend the next several hours with one of the most consequential aircraft ever built. Not simply because it was fast or because it was armed, but because everything about it was a contradiction. It was fragile yet lethal. It was celebrated in Japan and ignored in Washington. It was designed by a quiet, methodical engineer who despised war, yet it became the most feared symbol of a war that swept across 1/3 of the planet. Its name was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, and the story of how it came to exist, how it came to dominate, and how it eventually fell is the story of the entire Pacific War told through the life of a single machine. This documentary is not a glamorization of conflict. It is something more durable than that. It is an account of human ambition, institutional arrogance, engineering brilliance, and the slow, inevitable reckoning that follows when a weapon built for one kind of war finds itself trapped in another. There will be moments in this story that are difficult. Moments where the gap between what leaders believed and what was actually happening in the sky above the ocean was so enormous it almost defies explanation. There will also be moments of extraordinary human ingenuity, not the ingenuity of destruction, but the ingenuity of problem-solving under impossible constraints. If you are settling in for the night, you are in the right place. This is a long story, told slowly and carefully, with attention to the details that matter. Pour whatever you are having. Get comfortable. The lights over the Pacific are about to come on. We will be with you every hour of this journey. If this kind of deep dive documentary content speaks to you, the kind that trusts you with real history and treats your time as something worth spending carefully, then consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. This channel is built for exactly the audience that is watching right now. Welcome. Chapter 1. The Weight of an Impossible Demand. There is a kind of specification document that engineers dread, not because the requirements are vague, but because they are precise, and they demand things that the laws of physics, up to that point in history, have refused to allow. In the spring of 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy produced exactly such a document. It was addressed to two aircraft manufacturers, Nakajima Aircraft and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and it asked them to build a carrier-based fighter that was, in nearly every measurable dimension, ahead of anything that existed anywhere on Earth. The specifications were not a wish list. They were an ultimatum, and they would either produce a machine that changed history, or they would bury the careers of everyone who tried. The requirements were staggering in their ambition. The Navy wanted a maximum speed in excess of 270 knots at 4,000 meters altitude. It wanted a climb rate that could reach 3,000 meters in under 9.5 minutes. It demanded an operational endurance of 6 to 8 hours at economical cruising speed, the kind of range that would allow the aircraft to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still return safely to its carrier. The armament was to include two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, along with a pair of 60-kilogram bombs. And all of this had to fit inside an airframe with a wingspan of no more than 12 meters, because the hangars aboard Japanese aircraft carriers could not accommodate anything larger. Nakajima's engineering team read the requirements, sat down together, and concluded that the specifications were not achievable. They formally withdrew from the competition in January of that same year. It was not cowardice. It was, by the engineering standards of 1937, an entirely rational assessment. The combination of range, speed, climb, armament, and size that the Navy wanted had never been achieved simultaneously in any fighter aircraft anywhere in the world. The physics of the problem were unforgiving. Every kilogram of armor, every liter of fuel, every piece of equipment added to an airframe carries a cost in performance. To get everything the Navy wanted, a designer would have to find weight savings that did not yet exist, using materials that were barely understood from an industrial base that was still maturing. One man did not withdraw. Jiro Horikoshi was 34 years old, quiet in temperament, meticulous in method, and possessed of a specific kind of engineering vision that is rare in any era. He had trained in aeronautics, spent time studying aircraft development abroad, and returned to Japan with a deep understanding of what separated a good aircraft from a great one. Greatness, he believed, came not from adding things but from subtracting them. Every decision in a high-performance aircraft design was a negotiation between competing demands, and the only way to win that negotiation was to be brutally honest about what you were willing to sacrifice. Horikoshi was willing to sacrifice more than almost anyone else would have dared. The material that made his vision possible was a proprietary aluminium alloy developed by Sumitomo Metal Industries in 1936. The Navy classified it as a secret. Called extra super duralumin, it was lighter and stronger than anything being used by Western aircraft manufacturers at the time. It was also prone to corrosion, which required a careful anti-corrosion coating after fabrication, a limitation that Horikoshi's team incorporated into their workflow rather than treating it as a disqualification. Using this alloy, combined with an obsessive stripping away of every gram of unnecessary weight, Horikoshi began to sketch the outline of something that Nakajima had declared impossible. The choice to omit armor plating for the pilot was one of the most consequential decisions in the aircraft's history. Self-sealing fuel tanks, which were becoming standard equipment in fighter aircraft across Europe and America, were also left out. Both decisions were made for exactly the same reason: the weight penalty was incompatible with meeting the Navy's performance requirements. This was not negligence. It was a calculated trade, made consciously and with full awareness of its implications. A lighter aircraft could fly farther, turn faster, and climb harder than a heavier one. In the aerial warfare doctrine of the late 1930s, when Japan's strategic priority was projecting power over enormous oceanic distances, those qualities mattered more than the survivability of any individual pilot. The men who would fly this aircraft were being asked to be extraordinary. In exchange, the aircraft would give them tools to match. The first two A6M prototypes were completed in March of 1939, powered by the 580-kilowatt Mitsubishi A6M engine. The first flight took place on the 1st of April of that year, a date that would prove to carry no irony whatsoever. The aircraft performed almost immediately beyond expectations. Within months, the Navy was requesting that the third prototype be fitted with the more powerful Nakajima Sakai 12 engine, producing 940 horsepower, and when that version flew, the numbers it produced pushed past the original specifications in nearly every category. Mitsubishi had been somewhat reluctant to use a rival's engine. The performance figures ended that conversation. What emerged from Horikoshi's process was not simply a capable fighter. It was, by the engineering standards of 1939, a phenomenon. The aircraft combined a low-wing cantilever monoplane layout, itself a marker of modern design, with a retractable undercarriage, enclosed cockpit, and a wing loading so low that it could turn inside almost any aircraft then flying. The controls were light and responsive. The range was extraordinary, exceeding that of most contemporary bombers. And the entire machine, fully loaded, weighed roughly the same as a large American sedan. It had been built to be exactly as light as the mission required and not 1 gram heavier. The Navy had asked for the impossible. Horikoshi had simply decided that the word did not apply. The aircraft received its formal designation as the Navy Type 0 carrier fighter. The name came from the last digit of the Japanese imperial calendar year, 2600, which corresponded to 1940, the year it officially entered service. In Japanese, it was called the Reishiki Kanjo Sentoki. Pilots would come to call it simply the Zero Sen. Western intelligence, when they finally began to acknowledge its existence, would eventually give it the Allied reporting code name Zeke. But the name that history remembers, the name that would come to mean both invincibility and its loss, was simply the Zero, and in the summer of 1940, it went to war. The world it flew into was not ready for it. Most of the men in Washington and London who would have been responsible for understanding what the Zero was had either not read the intelligence reports, had dismissed them as exaggerated, or had decided that a nation they had spent decades underestimating was incapable of producing something genuinely new. That assumption, institutional, almost reflexive, would cost a great deal before it was corrected. The aircraft that Jiro Horikoshi built in spite of every barrier placed in front of him was not simply a weapon. It was proof that a problem without an obvious solution is not the same as a problem without a solution at all. Chapter 2. The World That Built the Zero. To understand what the Zero was, it helps enormously to understand the world that made it necessary. Japan in the 1930s was not a nation that had always possessed a sophisticated aviation industry. For most of the preceding 2 decades, Japanese aircraft had been derivative built on licensed designs from Germany, Britain, France, and the United States, assembled by an industrial base that was small, fragmented, and heavily dependent on foreign expertise. Production numbers tell the story plainly. In 1930, Japan produced roughly 445 aircraft of all types. By 1936, that number had risen to just over 1,100. These were not the figures of a nation preparing to challenge the air forces of the Western world. They were the figures of a nation still learning to walk in the sky. But within that modest foundation, something was changing. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been studying naval aviation with a seriousness and intellectual depth that its eventual opponents consistently failed to credit. Japanese naval officers had watched the development of carrier-based aviation in Britain and America and had drawn conclusions that went considerably further than their Western counterparts. They understood that the aircraft carrier was not simply a new platform for delivering old capabilities. It was a fundamentally different way of projecting power across oceanic distances, and that the aircraft operating from those carriers would need to be categorically better than anything that had come before, because they would be fighting far from any land base, over waters where the margin for error was zero. The development of the Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero's direct predecessor, had already shown that Japanese engineers were capable of producing world-class carrier fighters when given serious requirements and adequate resources. The A6M was a clean, modern monoplane, far ahead of the biplanes still in service with many Western navies at the same time. It served in China from 1937 onward and acquitted itself well. But its range was limited, its armament was modest, and the conflict in China was making it increasingly clear that the next generation of aircraft would need to reach targets that the A6M simply could not reach. China was vast. The distances between Japanese carrier positions and the inland cities where Chinese nationalist resistance was centered were enormous. A fighter with truly long range, one that could escort bombers hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory and still return, was not a theoretical wish. It was an operational necessity. The war in China shaped almost every decision that went into the Zero's design. Japanese naval aviation had been flying real combat missions over real Chinese cities since 1937, accumulating the kind of operational experience that Western air forces were still working through in peacetime exercises and theoretical planning documents. Japanese pilots knew what it felt like to fly for 3 hours to reach a target, fight, and then fly 3 more hours home. They knew what it felt like to escort slow bombers through intercepting enemy fighters. They knew the difference between an aircraft that could theoretically reach a target and one that could actually reach it, fight effectively, and then survive the return journey. The Zero was, in this sense, built out of experience as much as it was built out of aluminium alloy and engineering calculations. The broader industrial context matters too. Japan's aircraft production infrastructure in the late 1930s was consolidating around a small number of major manufacturers, of which Mitsubishi was the most prominent. The Navy had run a series of competitive procurement programs in the early part of the decade that had forced manufacturers to develop real engineering capability rather than simply copying foreign designs. By the mid-30s, Mitsubishi had produced aircraft good enough to compete with Western equivalents, and in some cases to surpass them. The institutional knowledge built through that process, the material science, the manufacturing techniques, The accumulated understanding of how to trade off competing design requirements was exactly the foundation that Horikoshi needed when the Navy handed him its impossible specification document. What the Japanese industrial system could not yet do, and what this would matter enormously later in the war, was produce aircraft in the volumes that a protracted conflict would require. The production infrastructure was talented but not deep. The supply chains for critical materials, the special aluminium alloys, the precision instruments, the optical equipment were thin. The training pipeline for skilled workers was not oriented toward the kind of mass production that American industry had been developing for decades. None of this was visible in 1939, when the Zero was new and the Pacific War had not yet begun. But it was there, embedded in the structure of the system, waiting for the moment when the war would demand more than the system had been designed to give. There is another dimension to the context that deserves attention, and it is one that aviation historians sometimes underemphasize. The Zero was not designed in a vacuum of pure engineering. It was designed inside an institutional culture, the Imperial Japanese Navy, that had specific beliefs about what warfare required and what warriors were. The decision to omit pilot armor, for instance, was not merely an engineering trade-off. It reflected a set of values about the relationship between a pilot and his aircraft, about the nature of the elite fighting man, about the proper balance between individual protection and collective performance. Western air forces of the period were moving toward heavier, more protective aircraft, partly because they were building air forces designed for expansion and replacement systems designed for mass. The Japanese Naval Air Force was building something more concentrated, more elite, more fragile in its dependency on the quality of its individual pilots. That concentration of quality would be the Zero's greatest strategic asset, and eventually its most devastating vulnerability. In 1937 and 1938, as Horikoshi's team bent over their drafting tables and argued over wing loading calculations and fuel capacity margins, the men who would fly their creation were being trained to a standard that was, by any objective measure, among the highest in the world. Japanese naval aviators underwent years of training, filtering down from large initial cohorts to a small number of genuinely exceptional combat pilots. The Zero was designed for those men precise, experienced, capable of extracting every fraction of the aircraft's potential. What the design did not account for, could not have accounted for in 1939, was what would happen when those men were gone. The world that built the Zero was a world that believed in the decisive edge, the one weapon, the one moment, the one campaign that would settle the question of Pacific dominance before the weight of industrial production could be brought to bear. It was a belief that made a great deal of strategic sense given Japan's real constraints, and it produced an aircraft of genuine and extraordinary quality. But it also produced an aircraft whose greatness was inseparable from the fragility of the system that surrounded it. The Zero and the Naval Air Force that operated it were built for a short, decisive war. The war they got was neither short nor, in the end, decisive in the direction Japan required. The first two A6M prototypes had already proven themselves in flight testing by the end of 1939. The production version, the A6M2, was being refined and readied. 15 pre-production aircraft were shipped to China before formal testing was even complete, which was itself a measure of how urgent the Navy considered the Zero's deployment to be. In the summer of 1940, those 15 aircraft arrived in Manchuria and were sent to the war in China. What happened next would announce to the entire Pacific for those willing to listen that something genuinely new had entered the sky. Chapter 3. Fire over Chongqing. The 13th of September, 1940, is a date that appears in history books with a strange quietness, given what it actually represented. There were no declarations, no ceremonies, no diplomatic consequences. What happened over the Chinese city of Chongqing that morning was, from the outside, simply another air battle in a war that had already been going on for 3 years. 13 Japanese aircraft had escorted 27 bombers toward the city. The Chinese Air Force had sent up roughly 30 aircraft to intercept them. What followed lasted less than 30 minutes. When it was over, the relationship between speed, range, and firepower in Pacific air combat had been permanently altered, and almost nobody in Washington or London had the slightest idea. To understand the significance of the Chongqing engagement, it is necessary to understand what the Chinese pilots were flying. The defenders were equipped with Soviet-built Polikarpov I-15 biplanes and I-16 monoplanes, aircraft that were not antiques, exactly, but that belonged to an earlier generation of thinking about what a fighter should be. The I-16 in particular was a capable little machine, the first monoplane fighter with a retractable undercarriage to enter service anywhere in the world. It had fought with distinction in the Spanish Civil War. Its pilots were not novices. They were combat-experienced men defending their wartime capital against a raid they knew was coming. The 13 Zero fighters that arrived as escort had never been encountered in combat before. The Chinese pilots had no intelligence briefing that would have told them what the aircraft's flight characteristics were, how fast it could climb, what its armament consisted of, or how its pilots were trained. They approached the engagement with the assumptions that 3 years of fighting Japanese aircraft had given them assumptions about reaction times, about turning performance, about what evasive action would work. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. The Zero was not a refinement of what had come before. It was a different category of machine, operating according to different rules, and the men flying it had trained for years on a doctrine built around exactly the kind of engagement that was now unfolding over Chongqing. Japanese accounts claimed that all 27 Chinese fighters were destroyed in the engagement without a single Zero lost. Later historical examination suggested the numbers were somewhat different Chinese records, and independent historians estimated between 13 and 24 Chinese aircraft actually destroyed, and at least some Zero aircraft sustained damage. The precise figure is less important than what happened next. The Chinese Air Force, after Chongqing, ordered a halt to all further aerial combat with the Zero. The commanders of the Chinese Nationalist Air Force concluded, after one engagement, that their pilots could not survive a turning fight with the aircraft that had appeared in their skies. That was not a misreading of the situation, it was an accurate assessment of what had just occurred. The Zero's performance in China, in the months that followed, only deepened that assessment. By the time the pre-production aircraft were redeployed a year later, the Zero force operating over China had accumulated a kill ratio that, in terms of recorded air combat history, was almost without parallel. By some accounts, 99 Chinese aircraft were destroyed in exchange for virtually no operational losses. By other accounts, the number was higher, as many as 266 Chinese aircraft claimed over the course of the campaign. The specific numbers are contested, as all air combat tallies are, but the direction of the evidence is unambiguous. The Zero, in China, was not competitive with the opposition. It was categorically dominant. Word of this domination did reach the United States. Major Claire Lee Chennault, the former United States Army Air Corps advisor who was training and commanding Chinese air forces, filed detailed intelligence reports describing the Zero's capabilities. He described its extraordinary maneuverability, its range, its climb rate. He made specific tactical recommendations that American pilots should never attempt to outturn a Zero, should attack from high altitude and high speed, should dive away and never engage in the kind of sustained circling dogfight that the Zero's handling characteristics made virtually unwinnable for any contemporary Allied aircraft. Chennault's reports were precise, operationally grounded, and based on direct observation of real combat over China. The response from analysts within the United States War Department was, in the word used by one subsequent account, skepticism. Some dismissed Chennault's reports as fabrications. Others concluded that the performance numbers he had described were aerodynamic impossibilities, that no aircraft, with the range and agility the reports described, could also have the speed and firepower. The Zero appeared to violate the engineering intuitions of analysts who had not seen it, based on the assumption that Japan could not have produced something that good. This was not stupidity. It was institutional bias, compounded by a lack of imagination, the assumption that the boundaries of the possible were defined by what the best-known manufacturers in the world had already achieved. It was a failure of inference so complete and so consequential that it would still be costing lives more than a year later. Horikoshi, working in Nagoya, was not reading those American intelligence assessments. He was reviewing the combat reports from China and making careful notes about what modifications the operational experience was suggesting. Small changes to the wing and control surfaces, refinements to the folding wingtip mechanism that allowed the Model 21 variant to be stored in carrier hangars. The continuous, meticulous cycle of observation, analysis, and adjustment that characterizes genuinely good engineering, the process of treating a weapon not as a finished object, but as a living system that learns from its own deployment. In the background of all this, Mitsubishi was scaling up production. The Navy had placed orders that made clear what was being planned. The China campaign had been a demonstration. What was coming next was something of an entirely different scale. By the end of 1940, the Zero had proven itself in combat beyond any reasonable expectation. Its operational debut over Chongqing had established a kill ratio that almost no aircraft in the preceding 2 decades of aviation history could match. Its pilots were confident, experienced, and trained on a tactical doctrine that had been tested and refined in real combat conditions. The aircraft itself was being manufactured in growing numbers, 98 total, by the end of its first production year at the Mitsubishi facility alone. The machine that Nakajima had declared impossible was not only flying, it was winning. What the combat reports from China did not yet reveal, because the conditions had not yet arisen to reveal it, was what the Zero could not do. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, which meant a single round of incendiary ammunition in the right place could turn it into a fireball. Its pilots sat without armor, which meant that the same high rate of fire weapons that Allied fighters were beginning to carry could end a mission and a life simultaneously. At high speeds, above roughly 270 kilometers per hour, the aileron forces became heavy, and the aircraft's roll rate deteriorated to the point where certain evasive maneuvers became difficult to execute. These were not secrets hidden inside classified technical documents. They were physical realities baked into the design decisions that had made the Zero everything it was. And there was a moment coming, not so far in the future, when an enemy with the right aircraft and the right information and the right doctrine would discover every single one of them. Chapter 4. The Man Behind the Machine. There is a temptation, when writing the history of a weapon, to treat the engineer who designed it as a background figure, important in the technical narrative, but peripheral to the human one. Jiro Horikoshi does not fit that pattern. He was born on the 22nd of June, 1903, in Fujioka, in Gunma Prefecture. He died on the 11th of January, 1982. In the 78 years between those dates, he designed a machine that is still recognized, 8 decades after its last flight, as one of the most technically remarkable aircraft in the history of aviation. He also spent the better part of his later life trying to explain to the world, and perhaps to himself, how he felt about what he had made. Horikoshi studied aeronautical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University, graduating with academic distinction. He joined Mitsubishi in the mid-1920s and quickly established himself as a designer of unusual ability, not a prodigy in the flashy sense, but someone with a deep, systematic understanding of how engineering problems actually worked. His approach was iterative and evidence-based. He was not someone who imposed a vision on a problem and then worked backward to justify it. He was someone who looked at the problem clearly, identified the constraints, and then worked systematically through the space of possible solutions until he found one that actually fit. That method, disciplined and patient, was exactly what the Zero's design requirements demanded. The design of the Zero occupied Horikoshi and his team from 1937 through to the aircraft's entry into service in 1940. It was not a glamorous period. It was a period of long hours spent over structural calculations, weight budgets, materials testing, and the slow, grinding process of resolving conflicts between competing performance requirements. Every decision carried consequences. Every gram saved on one system had to be justified against the risks it created. The choice to use extra superduralumin throughout the airframe, for instance, gave Horikoshi the weight savings he needed, but it also meant that every fabricated part had to be carefully treated against corrosion, which added complexity to manufacturing and maintenance. Simplicity was purchased at the cost of precision. The relationship between Horikoshi and the Navy is a complicated one to characterize from the available historical record. He was, by all accounts, deeply professional in his dealings with the institutional client, responsive to requirements, rigorous in his documentation, clear in his communication of trade-offs. But he was also, as would become evident in his later writings, someone who had significant private reservations about the purpose to which his engineering was being directed. He was not, by temperament or conviction, a militarist. He had not designed the Zero out of ideological commitment to the imperial project. He had designed it because he was an engineer given a difficult problem, and his entire professional identity was organized around solving difficult problems well. The uses to which the solution was put were not entirely within his control. This tension between the act of creation and the consequences of what was created would define Horikoshi's public legacy in the decades after the war. He published his memoirs, wrote extensively about the technical history of the Zero, and became one of the most thoughtful and honest commentators on the aircraft that bore his name. He did not seek to distance himself from the Zero. He engaged with its history directly and with a degree of moral seriousness that is, in the literature of wartime engineering, relatively unusual. The film director Hayao Miyazaki would later make him the subject of a celebrated animated film, a work that captured something essential about the painful complexity of a man whose finest professional achievement was inseparable from a conflict that caused enormous suffering. The team that Horikoshi assembled around him deserves acknowledgement as well, because the Zero was not a single genius creation. It was a collaborative engineering achievement of the first order, produced by a group of men working under considerable pressure, with limited resources, against a deadline that the Navy had made clear was not negotiable. The aerodynamics team worked through the implications of the Navy's wing loading requirements. The structures team managed the weight budget. The systems team integrated the avionics, the armament, the fuel system, the undercarriage. All of this had to fit together into an aircraft that a carrier-based naval pilot could fly in combat, maintain in the field, and recover safely to a moving deck at sea. The organizational achievement was as significant as the technical one. The prototype flew in April of 1939 and exceeded the Navy's performance specifications almost immediately. It was not the kind of dramatic debut that makes for easy storytelling. There were no crowds, no ceremonies, no announcements. There was a test pilot, an airstrip, a sequence of careful flight envelope explorations, and then a set of numbers that came back better than expected. Horikoshi read those numbers and continued working. There were still modifications to make, still refinements to incorporate, still the process of taking a prototype that worked and turning it into a production aircraft that could be manufactured reliably, maintained in the field, and operated from a carrier at sea. The gap between a working prototype and a combat-ready production aircraft is where most of the real engineering work happens, and Horikoshi understood that gap intimately. By the time the Zero entered operational service in the summer of 1940, Horikoshi had moved on to other projects. The Navy had other requirements, other specifications, other problems that needed the same methodical attention. The Zero was no longer a design challenge. It was a manufactured product, increasingly produced by factories running ever longer shifts as the Navy's requirements expanded. Horikoshi would return to the Zero periodically to oversee modifications, to review operational feedback, to advocate for improvements that the Navy's institutional conservatism sometimes made difficult to implement. But the central act of creation was complete. What remained was watching what the world made of it. What the world made of it was a legend, and legends, as Horikoshi understood better than most of the people who celebrated them, are complicated things to live with. The Zero was celebrated in Japan as proof of national capability evidence that Japanese engineering and Japanese pilots were the equal or superior of anything the Western world could produce. That celebration was not wrong exactly. The aircraft was genuinely extraordinary. But it was also a celebration that obscured the things the Zero was not, the things it could not do, the price embedded in its brilliance. Horikoshi knew those things. He had put them there himself, deliberately, because the Navy's requirements had left him no choice. The man behind the machine was not defined by the machine. though the machine defined how history would remember him. He was a professional who worked with integrity and skill inside a system that was moving toward a catastrophe he could not prevent. He built the best aircraft that the constraints of his time and place permitted him to build. He did it with his eyes open, documenting the trade-offs, recording the reasons, preserving the evidence for a future generation of engineers who would need to understand not just what the Zero was, but why. That kind of professional honesty in the face of institutional pressure, wartime urgency, and the simplified glory that legends demand is its own form of engineering accomplishment. Chapter 5. The Model 21 and the Carrier Problem. Aircraft carriers are not convenient places to operate fighter planes. The deck is short, the sea is unpredictable, the wind is variable, and the mechanics of bringing a high-performance aircraft down from 300 kilometers per hour to a complete stop in the length of a city block involve forces that are, to put it plainly, unpleasant. Every aircraft designed for carrier operations carries the weight of those constraints in its bones, in the reinforced undercarriage, in the arresting hook, in the structural compromises that come from building something that has to survive both the violence of combat and the violence of a carrier landing. The Zero carried all of those constraints and also, uniquely for its era, managed to be genuinely exceptional in spite of them. The variant that would define the Zero's early war career was the A6M2 Model 21. It was powered by the 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai 12 air-cooled engine, producing 950 horsepower at 4,200 meters. This engine, a twin-row radial of relatively compact dimensions, was related through a licensing genealogy that wound back through French aircraft engine development to the Gnome-Rhone Mistral Major. It was not the most powerful engine available. It was the most appropriate engine available, a careful choice made in full understanding that excess power on a poorly optimized airframe is less valuable than appropriately calibrated power on an airframe built for that exact output. The Model 21 introduced folding wingtips, a mechanism that allowed the 12-meter wingspan to be reduced sufficiently to fit in the elevator spaces and hangar decks of Japanese fleet carriers. This was not a trivial engineering problem. A folding wingtip that works correctly in the hangar but fails to lock solidly in flight is not a solution. It is a catastrophe waiting for altitude. Horikoshi's team engineered the fold mechanism to be simple and reliable, operated manually by deck crew, with a positive locking system that confirmed the wing was fully extended before the pilot taxied onto the flight deck. The simplicity of the mechanism was itself a design achievement. Carrier aircraft live or die by maintainability, and a complex system that fails under salt spray and physical wear is a liability in a way that a simple, robust system is not. The range that the Model 21 achieved was, by the standards of 1941, almost shocking. The internal fuel capacity, combined with the ability to carry an additional 330-litre drop tank under the fuselage, gave the aircraft a ferry range of more than 3,000 kilometers, farther than many twin-engine bombers of the period. The operational combat radius, the distance at which a pilot could actually fight and still have enough fuel to return, was roughly 800 kilometers, which was more than double what most Allied carrier fighters could achieve. This range was the feature that, perhaps more than any other single characteristic, made the Zero a strategic asset rather than simply a tactical one. It allowed Japanese carrier forces to project effective fighter cover over distances that Allied commanders had not believed possible, which meant that Zero fighters appeared in places and at times when no intelligent assessment of Japanese carrier positions should have predicted them. The practical effect of this range on Allied intelligence analysis was both subtle and devastating. When Zero fighters appeared over Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, escorting and protecting the attacking formations, Allied analysts looking at the subsequent engagement reports struggled to reconcile the locations of known Japanese carrier groups with the documented presence of high-performance Zero fighters over distant targets. The most common working assumption had been that the Zeros present were land-based aircraft operating from nearby fields that a carrier fighter could not have come from that far away. The assumption was wrong. The Zero had come from carriers positioned far beyond the range that Allied planners had judged sufficient for fighter operations. At the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Imperial Japanese Navy had 521 Zeros in active service in the Pacific, with 328 of those in frontline units. The carrier-borne Model 21 was the type that American pilots and commanders first encountered. The aircraft that arrived over Pearl Harbor was, in every measurable performance parameter, superior to every carrier fighter the United States Navy had in service. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the principal American carrier fighter of the period, was slower, had less range, climbed less aggressively, and could not match the Zero in a turning fight. It weighed considerably more, roughly 2,360 kilograms for the Zero fully loaded versus approximately 3,560 kilograms for the Wildcat. In a one-on-one turning engagement, the outcome was, for American pilots who did not know the tactics that could compensate for the mismatch, nearly predetermined. The Zero's weapons were well matched to its role. The two 20mm Type 99 cannons mounted in the wings fired a projectile of sufficient weight and velocity to destroy an aircraft with a single accurate burst. The two 7.7mm machine guns in the engine cowling provided a high rate of fire for situations where the heavier cannons were not needed or the ammunition conservation required lighter weapons. The combination gave Zero pilots flexibility, the ability to begin an engagement with a burst of machine gun fire to gauge range and deflection, and then commit the cannons when a clean hit was achievable. The limitation was ammunition capacity. The cannon drums carried only 60 rounds each in the original configuration, which imposed a discipline on firing that some pilots found constraining in extended engagements. The production ramp-up that accompanied the Model 21's entry into service was rapid by the standards of Japanese manufacturing at the time. The Mitsubishi facility at Nagoya was producing the aircraft in increasing quantities through 1940 and 1941, while Nakajima's facility at Ota was brought online to produce the same design under license. Together, the two facilities would eventually produce the enormous totals that defined the Zero's production history, Mitsubishi building 3,879 aircraft, Nakajima building 6,538, with additional trainer and floatplane variants, bringing the total to more than 10,000 aircraft across all variants. But in the final months of 1941, as the last diplomatic communications between Tokyo and Washington were reaching their exhausted conclusion, the production numbers were still modest enough to equip the carrier forces that would execute the planned operations, but not yet sufficient to absorb the losses that a sustained war of attrition would impose. The Model 21 was as ready as the Navy could make it. The carriers were positioned and provisioned. The pilots had trained beyond exhaustion and emerged from that training as some of the most skilled aviators then flying anywhere on Earth. The planning for the operations that would open the Pacific War had been running for the better part of a year, tested and revised, and tested again by staff officers who understood what success required and what failure would cost. On the 1st of December 1941, the Combined Fleet Commander issued the order that would set all of it in motion. The aircraft carried the weight of all those calculations, all those years of engineering, all those hours of pilot training, aloft into the Pacific morning. What happened next would define the next 4 years of the world's history. Chapter 6. The Sky over Pearl Harbor. The morning of the 7th of December, 1941 carried the particular clarity of a Hawaiian winter day, the air washed by overnight rain, the mountains above Oahu catching the early light in ways that even the men who had been stationed there for years found remarkable. On the airfields and in the harbor below, the day was beginning, in the ordinary way that peacetime Sundays begin slowly, without urgency, with the comfortable predictability of a routine that had been the same for months. Aboard the American ships anchored in the harbor, duty watches were changing. On the airfields, the aircraft were lined up in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip, placed that way specifically to prevent sabotage from the ground. It was a decision that made the aircraft impossible to defend from the air. The Japanese carrier striking force that had crossed the North Pacific in radio silence since late November consisted of 6 fleet carriers, with a combined complement of more than 350 aircraft. The Zero fighters assigned to the mission were tasked with 2 distinct roles: suppressing American fighter opposition and providing close escort for the attacking torpedo bombers and dive bombers. The tactical planning had been meticulous. The routes from the carrier launch positions had been chosen to minimize the chance of early detection. The timing of the various attacking waves had been sequenced to maximize disruption and minimize the ability of American forces to organize a coordinated response. The plan was, by the standards of offensive air planning in 1941, exceptionally well constructed. The American radar operators who detected the approaching formation did detect it. The returns appeared on their screens at roughly 0702 hours, large and unmistakable, a massive aircraft more than 130 miles to the north. The information was passed up through the relevant channels. The duty officer who received it concluded that the formation was probably a group of American B-17 Flying Fortresses scheduled to arrive that morning from the mainland. The radar contact was, therefore, noted and disregarded. The opportunity to scramble defending aircraft and place at least some fighters in the air before the attacking formations arrived was lost in the space of that misidentification. When the first Japanese aircraft arrived over the harbor, the American defenders had essentially no organized fighter opposition. The Zeros that preceded and accompanied the attacking formations had little to do in the way of aerial combat during the first wave. The resistance was disorganized, the defenders caught on the ground or scrambling in ones and twos into conditions that the Zero's performance characteristics made catastrophically disadvantageous. What did become apparent during the engagement, and what was noted in the operational debrief reports filed afterward, was the way in which American pilots who did manage to get airborne instinctively attempted the wrong tactics. They tried to turn with the Zeros. They tried to outclimb them in a straight pull. They tried to bring their guns to bear in the kind of sustained, close-range circling fight that the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability made into a systematic execution rather than a contest. The physical destruction accomplished in the harbor and on the airfields was extensive. The operational analysis of those results, however, was always secondary to the strategic question: had the attack achieved its primary purpose? The strike planners had intended to neutralize American naval power in the Pacific sufficiently to allow Japan to consolidate its position across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific before American industrial capacity could respond. In terms of the immediate material balance, the attack was a tactical success of considerable proportions. In terms of the strategic objective it was meant to serve, the picture was more complicated from the very first day. The American aircraft carriers Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga were not in Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. They were at sea, absent from the harbor on various missions, and they survived the attack untouched. The Navy's fuel storage facilities and repair infrastructure, which were as important to long-term operational capacity as the battleships sitting in the harbor, were also left largely intact. The attack had struck the most visible and symbolic targets with considerable effectiveness, and had done so with a level of operational surprise that remains one of the most striking tactical achievements of the entire conflict. But it had not destroyed the capacity for response. It had provoked it. The Zero fighters that flew that morning carried themselves well by every operational measure. The aircraft performed as designed, executed the planned tasks, and returned to their carriers with losses that the planning staff considered acceptable. The ratio of aircraft destroyed to aircraft lost was, for the attacking force, heavily favorable. But in the days and weeks that followed the attack, as American commanders and analysts began to assemble the operational picture of what had just happened, the Zero's performance at Pearl Harbor contributed to a problem that its manufacturers and operators would spend the next year managing: the problem of its own reputation. An aircraft that has destroyed its opposition so completely that no effective tactical response was mounted has not yet been tested. It has been demonstrated. Testing, real testing, requires an opponent who knows what they are doing. The Allied pilots who encountered the Zero in the weeks and months following the Pearl Harbor attack and the opening of the broader Pacific and Southeast Asian campaigns were not, initially, pilots who knew what they were doing against it. They were courageous, many of them, and often skilled. But they were flying the wrong aircraft with the wrong tactics against an opponent whose capabilities they did not yet understand. The results were predictably difficult. Over Malaya, over Burma, over the Philippines, over the waters of the Dutch East Indies, wherever the Zero appeared in those first months, it established itself as the dominant presence in the sky, accumulating an early war kill ratio that contributed enormously to the sense, in Allied capitals, that something genuinely unprecedented had been encountered. What existed in those first 6 months of the Pacific War was a gap between what the Zero could do and what Allied forces knew about what it could do. That gap had been open since Chongqing. It had been reported by Chennault and dismissed. It had been hidden inside intelligence documents that analysts had read skeptically or not at all. Now it was open in the most public and consequential way possible, in the form of pilot casualties, downed aircraft, and the progressive loss of territories that Allied commanders had assumed their air forces could defend. The gap would close. The process of closing it was already beginning, in the intelligence community, in the aircraft design offices, and in the minds of the pilots who had survived the early engagements and were working out, from bitter experience, what their opponents were actually doing. But before it closed, the Zero would rule. The Pacific sky in the opening months of 1942 belonged to a slender silver aircraft built by a quiet engineer in Nagoya, flown by men who had trained for years beyond what anyone had thought necessary, designed for a war that Japan needed to win quickly. It was, for that brief window, exactly as good as it had been designed to be. The question that none of the Japanese planning documents had adequately answered was what would happen when the window closed, when the Allied industrial machine came fully online, when the intelligence gap was shut, when better aircraft and better informed pilots appeared in the same skies where the Zero had been unchallenged. That question was already moving toward its answer. The men in the planning rooms and the design offices did not yet know how close it was. Chapter 7. The Early Pacific Storm. The weeks that followed Pearl Harbor moved with a speed that stunned the world. Not because speed itself was unusual in warfare, but because the geography involved was so enormous, thousands of kilometers of open ocean, dozens of island chains, the coastlines of 3 continents, and yet Japanese forces crossed it all, as though the distances had been folded down to something manageable. At the center of that movement, in every theater, over every contested stretch of ocean and jungle and harbor, the Zero was present. Not always in overwhelming numbers, sometimes in very small numbers, but present in a way that shaped every engagement, every decision, every tactical option available to the commanders on the Allied side who were trying to understand what was happening to them quickly enough to respond. The Philippines campaign that began in December of 1941 placed the Zero against what should have been a credible opposition force. American air power in the Philippines included a significant number of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and a squadron of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. The P-40 was not, by any stretch of analysis, an inferior aircraft. It was the principal American fighter of the period, used by the Royal Air Force in North Africa, by the Chinese Air Force under Chennault's American Volunteer Group, and by United States Army Air Forces units across multiple theaters. It was fast in a dive, reasonably well armed, and structurally robust. Against the Zero in a turning fight at low to medium altitude, to flown with conventional pre-war fighter tactics, it was at a severe disadvantage. The engagements over Luzon in the opening days of the Philippines campaign produced results broadly consistent with what had happened over China, and with what would happen in every theater in those first months. Japanese pilots, flying Zeros from both carriers and forward-deployed land bases, engaged American P-40s in the kinds of turning, climbing, close-range fights that Zero pilots had trained for, and that the aircraft's flight characteristics rewarded. The result was a level of American aircraft attrition that degraded the defending force faster than replacements could be brought in. By the time the Japanese landings on Luzon were fully established, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively broken as an organized defensive force. This was not entirely the Zero's work alone. The destruction of many aircraft on the ground in the opening strikes had done enormous damage, but the Zero's presence in the sky had ensured that reconstituting any effective fighter defense from what remained was, practically speaking, impossible. The Malayan campaign, running concurrently, added another dimension to the Zero's early war dominance. British air power in Malaya and Singapore included Brewster Buffalo fighters, an aircraft that has suffered in the historical record, partly because of its association with defeat, but that was, in 1941, genuinely outclassed by the Zero in nearly every performance category. The Buffalo was slower, less maneuverable, had shorter range, and was flown by pilots whose tactical training had not prepared them for the kind of opposition they encountered. Royal Australian Air Force and Royal Air Force pilots who flew it in combat against Zeros in Malaya found that the engagements were over faster than any pre-war exercise had prepared them to expect. The characteristic that Zero pilots reported most consistently, the aircraft's ability to reverse direction, change altitude, and present a new attack angle before the opponent could respond, was not something that conventional fighter training had provided any answer to. The Dutch East Indies campaign extended the Zero's operational reach into yet another theatre, against yet another collection of Allied aircraft types: Curtiss Hawk fighters, Hawker Hurricanes, Curtiss P-40s of the Netherlands, East Indies Army Air Force, all of which faced the same fundamental problem. The tactical engagement profile that standard Allied fighter doctrine favoured was exactly the engagement profile that the Zero was built to win. As long as Allied pilots attempted to fight the Zero on the Zero's terms and without specific tactical guidance, that is exactly what they attempted. The outcomes were broadly predictable. The losses accumulated not because Allied pilots were incompetent or cowardly, but because they were fighting the wrong battle without knowing a different battle was possible. In Burma and over the waters of the Indian Ocean, the pattern repeated. The Zero force that operated from carriers during Admiral Nagumo's Indian Ocean raid in April of 1942 extended Japanese naval air power into a geography that British commanders had considered beyond any plausible Japanese strike reach. The Zeros that escorted attacking formations over the British naval base at Colombo and the harbour at Trincomalee flew missions whose distances, measured against what British intelligence had assumed was achievable for carrier-based fighter operations, should not have been possible. They were possible because the Zero's range was real, had been real since 1939, and had been discounted in British and American planning assessments for long enough that the discounting had become structural, an assumption baked into operational planning rather than a hypothesis remaining open to revision. What was happening simultaneously in intelligence offices and design departments and pilot debriefs across the Allied world was the beginning of an answer. The answer was being assembled piece by piece from the fragments of information that combat experience was generating. Pilots who survived engagements with Zeros were debriefed, and the debrief reports were being read, collated, and compared against each other for patterns. Captured Japanese documents, some of them operational manuals, some of them maintenance records, were being translated and analysed. Technical intelligence officers were examining the wreckage of Zeros that had been shot down or had crash-landed in accessible terrain, measuring the dimensions of the airframe, estimating the materials used, reconstructing the engineering decisions that had produced the observable performance. The picture that was assembling from all these pieces was specific, accurate, and, once it was fully assembled, actionable. The kill ratios of the early Pacific campaign are among the most debated figures in the entire historiography of the war. Different sources, reflecting different accounting methodologies and different access to operational records on both sides, produce quite different numbers for the Zero's performance in specific engagements. What is not in serious dispute is the direction of the overall picture. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval aviation, equipped predominantly with the Zero, achieved results that no other air force in any theatre of the war achieved in the same period. The combination of aircraft quality, pilot quality, tactical doctrine, and the information asymmetry that had accumulated over the preceding year produced an operational record that was, in the early months of 1942, genuinely without parallel. The men who flew the Zero in those first months were not anonymous. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been developing its pilot culture for 2 decades, and the aviators who opened the Pacific War represented the end product of that development, an extraordinarily small number of men selected from large initial training cohorts through a process of attrition that removed the merely good and left only the exceptional. They were not pilots who had been given good aircraft. They were, to an unusual degree, exceptional pilots who had been given an aircraft precisely calibrated to their capabilities. The Zero demanded skill to extract its best performance, and the men flying it had that skill in abundance. The strategic question that the early campaign results could not answer, and that would define the trajectory of the Zero's entire subsequent history, was whether the conditions of the early months could be maintained. The information asymmetry was being corrected, the tactics were being revised, American industry was preparing to deliver aircraft in volumes that Japan's production system could not match. The men who were doing the analysis of early engagements, who were studying the wreckage and reading the debriefs and running the calculations, were getting closer every day to the specific tactical knowledge that would change the terms of engagement entirely. And somewhere on the Aleutian island of Akutan, an event was about to occur that would accelerate that process in a way that no amount of combat analysis had yet managed. Chapter 8. The Akutan Zero. There is a specific kind of fortune that changes the course of technical competitions. Not the fortune of genius or resources or organizational excellence, but the plain, arbitrary fortune of circumstance. A pilot makes a decision that he would not have made on any other day. A landing gear fails at exactly the wrong moment. An aircraft that was meant to sink into the sea comes to rest instead on soft tundra at the precise angle that keeps it intact. History is full of these moments, and the ones that matter most are the ones that no planning process could have anticipated and no analytical intelligence could have manufactured. The Zero that came down on the marshy ground near Akutan Island in the Aleutians on the 4th of July, 1942, was one of those moments. The pilot was Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga, a Zero pilot assigned to the carrier Ryujo, flying a Model 21 as part of a diversionary raid on the American base at Dutch Harbor in the eastern Aleutians. Koga was hit by ground fire during the engagement. The accounts vary on the precise nature and severity of the damage, but the effect was clear. His aircraft's landing gear locked down, making a carrier recovery impossible. He was flying over the island of Akutan, which Japanese aviators had been briefed to treat as a potential emergency landing site. He found a flat area of ground, set up his approach, and came in for a landing. What he could not see from the air, and what his maps had not adequately conveyed, was that the flat area was not solid ground. It was a bog-soft, yielding tundra that caught the lockdown landing gear the moment the wheels touched, flipped the aircraft forward, and left it inverted in the marsh. Koga did not survive the accident. The aircraft, however, was largely intact. Inverted in the soft ground, with the airframe protected from impact damage by the same landing gear catching surface that had caused the accident, it remained preserved in the Alaskan summer air for several weeks before an American survey team, acting on a report from a Catalina flying boat crew that had spotted the overturned aircraft, landed on Akutan to investigate. What they found was an aircraft that was, structurally and mechanically, in recoverable condition. The engine had stopped running when fuel was cut off by the inversion. The canopy was intact. The airframe was bent, but not broken in any way that a skilled repair team could not address. The aircraft was recovered with considerable difficulty. The marsh required the construction of a makeshift landing strip before any transport aircraft could reach the site and eventually shipped to the Naval Air Station at North Island in San Diego, where it was repaired to flying condition over the course of several months. The technical intelligence team that worked on the Akutan Zero was meticulous and systematic. They disassembled it, measured it, weighed every component, tested the engine, mapped the fuel system, analyzed the alloy composition of the structural members. They flew it extensively, testing its handling characteristics at all speeds and altitudes, mapping the precise performance envelope that Japanese operational security had been protecting since 1939. What they learned from those flight tests went directly into the tactical guidance that would be distributed to every American fighter unit operating in the Pacific. The most important finding from the Akutan Zero flight tests was the confirmation and precise quantification of something that experienced pilots had already begun to suspect from combat experience. Above roughly 222 kilometers per hour indicated airspeed, the Zero's ailerons stiffened substantially, and its roll rate deteriorated to the point where it became significantly easier for a faster, more structurally rigid aircraft to defeat it in a rolling dive. At low and medium speeds, the Zero's roll rate was outstanding, better than anything then in Allied service. At high speeds, the situation reversed. An aircraft that initiated a rolling dive from a position above the Zero, accelerating through and past its effective maneuver speed, could separate from the engagement faster than the Zero could follow, could reverse direction faster than the Zero could respond, and could re-engage on its own terms rather than the Zero's. The tactical corollary of this finding was direct and specific. Do not turn with the Zero. Do not attempt to outclimb it from a standing start at low speed. Do not engage in a sustained, close-range circling fight. Instead, use altitude advantage to initiate high-speed diving attacks, fire in passing, and extend away before the Zero can reverse and engage. If the Zero does manage to get a turning advantage, do not try to reverse the turn, dive away, accelerate, and re-engage from a position of speed and altitude. This was, in broad outline, exactly what Chennault had been recommending since his intelligence reports from China 3 years earlier. The Akutan Zero gave those recommendations a physical, measurable, undeniable foundation. It was no longer possible to argue that the Zero's weaknesses were theoretical. The specific improvements that the Akutan analysis drove in American aircraft development went beyond tactical guidance. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which would become the Zero's primary adversary in the middle and later stages of the Pacific War, incorporated design refinements specifically informed by what had been learned from the Akutan analysis and from the accumulated operational experience of the early campaigns. The Hellcat was designed to be faster than the Zero at all altitudes, particularly in a dive. It was designed with a roll rate that matched or exceeded the Zero at the speeds at which high-altitude combat typically occurred. It was given structural strength that allowed it to sustain damage that would have been fatal to the unprotected Zero, and self-sealing fuel tanks that significantly reduced its vulnerability to incendiary fire. None of these improvements was coincidental. They were the specific engineering answers to the specific vulnerabilities that technical intelligence had identified. The broader intelligence consequence of the Akutan Zero went beyond the Hellcat's design. The aircraft was used to develop specific gun camera calibration standards, specific attack angle analyses, and specific training scenarios for American naval aviators. Pilots who trained on programs informed by the Akutan analysis arrived in the Pacific theater with something that the pilots of 1941 had entirely lacked: a concrete, tested understanding of exactly when the Zero was dangerous and exactly when it was not. That knowledge did not make the Zero easy to fight. It made it possible to fight intelligently, which in aerial combat is approximately the same thing as fighting effectively. The Akutan Zero flew at North Island through the summer and autumn of 1942, accumulating flight test hours that were more valuable, in terms of tactical intelligence generated, than any number of combat sorties. American test pilots who flew it recorded their impressions in detail: the lightness of the controls at low speed, the way the aircraft seemed to read the pilot's intentions before they were fully formed, the extraordinary visibility from the open cockpit, and then, as speed built in a dive, the progressive stiffening of the ailerons, the way the aircraft began to feel less like an extension of the pilot's body and more like a structure that was approaching its limits. Those impressions, translated into tactical guidance and distributed to Pacific fighter units, represented the final closing of the information gap that had been opened since the first Zero appeared over Chongqing. The Zero did not know it had been read. The aircraft continued to be produced, continued to be deployed, continued to be flown by pilots who were, in many cases, still excellent. But the terms of the contest had changed. The first 6 months of the Pacific War had been defined by a gap between what the Zero was and what its enemies understood it to be. From the autumn of 1942 onward, that gap was closing with a speed proportional to the seriousness with which American industry, intelligence, and tactical development were now approaching the problem. The aircraft that had ruled the opening of the Pacific War was about to encounter an adversary that had studied it more carefully than any weapon in the history of the conflict had yet been studied. And the encounter was coming at exactly the moment when Japan's ability to replace what it was about to lose had passed its peak. Chapter 9. The Midway Turning Point. There is a peculiarity in how the Battle of Midway is remembered. It tends to be remembered primarily as a story about carriers and dive bombers, about the 4 Japanese fleet carriers that went to the bottom in one afternoon, about the geometry of the air attack that found them at the worst possible moment. And that memory is not wrong, it is simply incomplete. Because the Zero was present at Midway in force, performed its assigned mission with considerable tactical effectiveness in several respects, and still contributed to an outcome that fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The way in which the Zero could be simultaneously tactically successful and strategically pivotal to a catastrophe is one of the more instructive ironies in the aircraft's entire history. The Japanese plan for Midway, executed in the first week of June 1942, was the most ambitious naval operation in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The operation was intended to draw out and destroy the American carrier fleet, seize Midway Atoll as a forward base, and permanently establish the defensive perimeter that Japan needed to consolidate its Pacific position before American industrial production could shift the material balance. It was, in its conception, a plan that required everything to go approximately right: the sequence of attacks, the timing of the carrier movements, the response of American forces to the initial Midway strike. The intelligence preparation for the operation underestimated the degree to which American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications. American commanders knew the plan in considerable detail before the operation began. The Zero fighters assigned to combat air patrol over the Japanese carrier force on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, were drawn down to low altitude by a wave of American torpedo bombers that attacked in the kind of slow, vulnerable, low-level runs that Zero pilots were exceptionally well equipped to counter. The torpedo bombers, Devastators, from the carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown were shot down in devastating numbers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost every single aircraft in its attack, with only one pilot surviving. The Zeros that performed this destruction were doing exactly what they were designed to do, flying the engagement profile they had trained for, executing a tactical mission with terrible effectiveness. But while those Zeros were at low altitude, their fuel and ammunition partially spent, the dive bombers were coming in from high altitude. The Douglas SBD Dauntlesses that dove on the Japanese carriers in the 3-minute window that became the most decisive moment of the Pacific War found the decks of those carriers in the worst possible configuration aircraft. Being rearmed and refueled, weapons staged on the hangar decks, fuel hoses running across the flight decks. The combat air patrol Zeros were out of position, low and slow, exactly the wrong place and attitude for intercepting a high-altitude dive attack. The connection between the Zero's successful interception of the torpedo bombers and the Japanese carrier's vulnerability to the dive bombers was not accidental. It was structural, the consequence of a combat air patrol doctrine that concentrated defensive fighters at low altitude, where the immediate threat was visible, leaving the high-altitude approach unguarded. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were all fatally damaged in the battle. With them went not only the carriers but the aircraft aboard them, and more critically, the experienced aircrews who could not be evacuated before the fires reached the fuel and ordnance. This was the dimension of Midway that made it irreversible in a way that purely material losses would not have been. Japan could eventually have built more carriers, though the production timeline was long and the industrial constraints severe. What Japan could not replace quickly were the experienced combat aviators, men who had trained for years, who had accumulated thousands of flight hours, who had refined their skills through 2 years of operational combat over China and the Pacific, who went down with those carriers or were killed in the battle's subsequent engagements. The Zero production line was still running at Nagoya and Ota. More aircraft were being built, but the institutional base of knowledge and skill that had made those aircraft so effective, the pilot corps that had opened the Pacific War with such decisive results, was being degraded at a rate that the training pipeline could not match. Japanese naval aviation training was rigorous and long. A pilot trained to the standard required for frontline Zero operations took years to produce. The Midway losses accelerated a process of pilot quality dilution that had already begun modestly in the early campaign attrition, and that would continue to accelerate as the war demanded more aircraft, more sorties, and more replacement pilots from a training system that was not expanding fast enough to compensate. The Guadalcanal campaign that followed Midway in August of 1942 compounded the Zero's difficulties in a different way. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, once captured by American Marines, became a fixed point that Japanese forces had to contest continuously for 6 months. The Zeros based at Rabaul that were tasked with providing fighter cover over Guadalcanal were operating at the extreme limit of their already extraordinary range. The mission profiles were grueling long overwater transits each way, sustained combat over the objective, then the return flight with reduced fuel margins. Pilots who were hit over Guadalcanal and could not make the return distance were lost. Aircraft that sustained damage that would have been repairable at a closer base were written off. The Zero's range, which had been one of its greatest assets in the opening months, was now being consumed by an operational situation that demanded presence at a place the available bases could barely reach. American fighter tactics at Guadalcanal were also beginning to reflect the accumulated learning of the previous months. The Grumman Wildcat pilots of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 223, along with Army P-40s and P-39s, were flying the Thack Weave, a defensive maneuver developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thack specifically to address the Zero's turning advantage. The Thack Weave was an answer to the problem that Chennault had identified from China, that a single fighter trying to defend against a Zero in a turning fight was at a severe disadvantage, but that two fighters coordinating a crossing maneuver could create a geometry in which the pursuing Zero was forced into the gun sight of the second aircraft, no matter which target it chose to follow. The tactic was not a complete solution to the Zero's performance advantages. It was the beginning of a systematic answer, the first of several tactical innovations that would progressively reduce the operational space in which the Zero's qualities translated into combat dominance. The 6 months of fighting around Guadalcanal drained Japanese naval aviation in ways that did not appear immediately in the operational records, but that were accumulating at every level of the force. The experienced pilots who survived the Midway disaster were being worn down by the tempo of Guadalcanal operations. Replacement pilots arriving from the training pipeline were less experienced, less polished, less capable of extracting the full performance from their aircraft that the design demanded. The Zero's characteristics rewarded skill more than most aircraft of the period. Its light controls and exceptional low-speed maneuverability were genuinely valuable in the hands of an expert, but expertise was what the force was progressively losing. An aircraft perfectly calibrated for exceptional pilots was gradually finding itself in the hands of merely adequate ones. The fundamental problem that the Zero faced from mid-1942 onward was not a problem of the aircraft itself, though aircraft improvements were certainly overdue. It was a problem of system mismatch. The Zero had been designed as one component of a system that included exceptional pilots, specific tactical doctrines, and a strategic context that required decisive early results. When the strategic context shifted, when the pilot quality began to degrade, and when Allied tactical doctrine incorporated the specific corrections that combat experience and the Akutan analysis had generated, the aircraft that remained was the same aircraft Horikoshi had built. It was lighter and faster and more maneuverable than it had been in 1939. But the system around it had changed in ways that the aircraft's excellence alone could not compensate for. Midway is the hinge in the Zero story in the same way it is the hinge in the broader Pacific War. Before it, the Zero operated in conditions that maximized its advantages and minimized its vulnerabilities. After it, the conditions were changing in directions that the aircraft's design could not easily accommodate more capable Allied aircraft arriving in increasing numbers, more informed Allied tactics, and a degraded Japanese pilot corps that could no longer extract the full depth of what the Zero had to offer. The aircraft would continue to fight for 3 more years. It would produce individual moments of genuine excellence long after Midway, but the trajectory had bent, and the direction in which it was bending was becoming clearer with each passing month. Chapter 10. The Variants and the Engineer's Dilemma. The history of the Zero's development variants is, in miniature, the history of every attempt to extend the life of a design beyond the window for which it was originally conceived. It is the history of incremental improvement running perpetually behind the pace of the threat environment's evolution, the history of engineers who understood precisely what needed to change, who often proposed the right changes, and who were thwarted at every turn by institutional inertia, production constraints, and the peculiar institutional logic that leads organizations to protect a proven commodity even when the evidence is accumulating that the commodity is no longer adequate. Horikoshi and his colleagues were not passive in the face of the Zero's growing limitations. They were active, often frustrated, and sometimes genuinely creative in their responses. The result was an evolution of variants that improved the aircraft significantly in specific areas while leaving the fundamental vulnerabilities, the unprotected pilot, the non-self-sealing tanks, the high-speed handling limitations largely unaddressed. The A6M3, which entered service in 1942, represented a serious attempt to improve the Zero's speed and climb performance by fitting the more powerful Sakae-21 engine, which produced 1,130 horsepower compared to the 950 of the earlier Sakae-12. The new engine required a redesigned engine cowling and, to maintain the balance of the aircraft, a squared-off wing with clipped tips that eliminated the original folding mechanism. The result was an aircraft that was faster at altitude and had a better climb rate than the Model 21. It was also, partly because the more powerful engine consumed fuel more aggressively, somewhat shorter in range. The original wing folding tips had been eliminated to save weight and simplify production, but the loss of the fold capability created new complications for hangar stowage on the smaller carriers. The Model 22 introduced a new drop tank arrangement to partially restore the lost range. Every solution created new problems, as solutions to over-constrained design problems invariably do. The A6M5, which appeared in 1943 and became the most produced variant of the entire Zero series, was the aircraft that Horikoshi's team produced when they had worked through every refinement that was available within the basic airframe. It used an improved version of the Sakae-21 engine with a revised exhaust system that produced a modest additional increment of thrust. The wing structure was strengthened, allowing a higher never-exceed speed and improving the aircraft's ability to sustain high-speed dives without the risk of structural failure that had been a concern with earlier variants. The armament was progressively upgraded across sub-variants. The Model 5 Type C fitted heavier 13.2mm machine guns in the engine, cowling alongside the standard wing cannons, and the Model 5 Type D introduced an additional pair of 25mm cannons under the wings for ground attack missions. Each of these improvements was real and measurable. The A6M5 was a genuinely better aircraft than the Model 21 that had opened the war, and better in the dimensions that the operational experience of 1942 and 1943 had identified as most important. It was faster in level flight, and in a dive. It was structurally stronger. It carried more firepower in some configurations. The problem was that its primary opponents were also improving, and improving on a trajectory and at a pace that the Zero's development program could not match. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, which entered fleet service in 1943, was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the output of the Sakae-21. The Hellcat was heavier, less maneuverable at low speed, and consumed fuel at a rate that would have been unacceptable in a Zero. It was also faster at every altitude, had a higher diving speed, was armored for the pilot, had self-sealing tanks, and could absorb a level of combat damage that would have destroyed a Zero. The question that the Zero's development program faced, from the midpoint of the war onward, was whether it was possible to produce a fundamentally new aircraft quickly enough to matter, or whether the existing design could be stretched to cover the gap. The answer, in retrospect, was that the existing design could not be stretched far enough, and the new aircraft could not be produced quickly enough. Mitsubishi had been working on a Zero successor, the A7M Repu, since 1942. The Repu was, on paper, a genuinely competitive aircraft, large, powerful, with performance specifications that matched or exceeded the Hellcat. But it was still in development and testing in 1945 when the war ended. The engine it required, the Mitsubishi Ha-43, was itself behind schedule, underpowered in early versions, and plagued by the kind of development problems that complex new power plants almost invariably encounter. The institutional barriers to change within the Japanese Navy's procurement system were as significant as the technical ones. The Navy had invested enormously in doctrine, in training, in maintenance logistics, in the entire operational infrastructure of carrier-based aviation in the Zero and its specific characteristics. Transitioning to a new aircraft required not just a new production line, but a new training curriculum, new maintenance procedures, new tactical doctrine. None of that could happen overnight. The Navy's conservatism about introducing new aircraft types was not irrational. It reflected a genuine understanding of how much institutional knowledge was embedded in the existing system. But it also meant that the recognition of the Zero's growing limitations translated into concrete action more slowly than the pace of Allied development required. There were individual engineers and commanders within the Japanese system who understood the problem clearly and pushed hard for faster change. Some of them were listened to and some of them were not. The historical record of the design bureaus and the naval air staff contains arguments and proposals that, had they been implemented earlier, might have extended the Zero's competitive effectiveness by months or even longer. The armor and self-sealing tanks, in particular, were improvements that some engineers advocated for repeatedly from 1942 onward, and that the Navy resisted on grounds that included the weight penalty, the production complexity, and the deeply held belief embedded in the Naval Air Force's culture since before the Zero was designed that the best protection for a pilot was speed and maneuverability rather than passive armor. The weight argument against armor was, in the context of the original design, defensible. Adding armor to the Zero would have degraded the performance that made it competitive. But by 1943, the performance envelope of Allied fighters had expanded beyond what the Zero's maneuverability advantage could compensate for, and the pilot protection argument had changed its character entirely. A pilot killed in an unarmored cockpit by a burst from a Hellcat's 6 12.7mm Browning machine guns was not simply a combat loss. He was an irreplaceable, experienced aviator whose training and skills represented years of investment and whose loss contributed to the overall degradation of the pilot corps. The protection argument was no longer purely about weight and performance. It was about the sustainability of the human capital the system required. Production numbers tell part of this story in a way that is difficult to argue with. The United States produced 9,282 Hellcats during the war, with production rates that rose steadily from the aircraft's introduction in 1943 through to 1945. Japanese Zero production, across all variants and all manufacturers, reached just over 10,530 aircraft over the course of the entire war, a total achieved over several more years. From an industrial base that was increasingly constrained by raw material shortages, bombing raids on production facilities, and the difficulty of maintaining production quality as the skilled workforce was drawn down. The ratio of Hellcats to Zeros produced in the decisive year of 1944 was such that American carrier air groups were flying aircraft whose qualitative edge was compounded, rather than offset, by numerical superiority. The variants of the Zero are, taken together, a chronicle of genuine engineering competence applied to a problem that engineering competence alone could not solve. The aircraft improved steadily throughout the war. The men who built it never stopped trying to make it better. But the improvements were incremental, applied to a baseline that had been set in 1939 for conditions that no longer obtained, and they were running a race against a pace of Allied development that Japan's industrial capacity, material situation, and institutional culture could not match. The Zero's variant history is not the history of failure. It is the history of what happens when an excellent design meets a strategic context that has moved past it, and when the systems around that design cannot evolve quickly enough to keep up. Chapter 11. The Aces and the Vanishing Elite. There is a particular quality to the accounts left by the men who flew the Zero at its best, a quality of precision and calm that makes them unlike the combat memoirs of most other theatres, most other aircraft, most other wars. They describe the aircraft with the intimacy of someone describing a relationship, rather than a machine, the way it responded to small inputs, the way its controls communicated what the airframe was doing, the sensation of turning so tightly that the horizon became a vertical line. They describe combat with an economy of language that suggests not the suppression of feeling, but its transformation into something technical and purposeful. These were men who had been shaped by a training culture that valued precision and self-control above almost everything else. And the accounts they left reflect both the quality of what they were and the weight of what they were being asked to do. Among the most celebrated of the Zero's aces was Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, whose career embodied the qualities that made Japanese naval aviation so formidable in the early war years, and whose fate illustrated so precisely the trajectory of the force as a whole. Nishizawa entered combat in 1942 and accumulated a claimed total that, even accounting for the optimism that combat claim verification rarely fully corrects, was extraordinary by any comparative standard. He flew with an economy and precision that his fellow pilots remarked upon consistently, an absence of wasted movement, a willingness to hold his fire until the shot was certain, an ability to read an engagement's geometry from distances at which other pilots were still deciding what was happening. He flew the Zero as though it had been built specifically for his particular configuration of skills, which, in a real sense that Horikoshi never intended but that history supplied, it had. Saburo Sakai was another figure whose career traversed the arc of the Zero's entire wartime history. He survived the war despite wounds sustained over Guadalcanal in August of 1942 that cost him the sight in one eye and very nearly his life wounds inflicted from an unexpected direction by an aircraft he had. Misidentified at a moment of fatigue and inattention. His account of that day, and of the 3-hour return flight to Rabaul with serious head wounds and half his vision gone, is one of the more remarkable personal accounts in the literature of aerial combat. He survived, recovered, and flew again. What his story illustrates, at the level of the broader system rather than the individual, is the kind of pilot the Zero required and the cost of maintaining that quality under sustained operational pressure. The training pipeline that had produced Nishizawa and Sakai and the other aces of the early Pacific campaign was, by design, a filter. Large numbers of candidates entered the initial training phases. Only a small percentage, those who demonstrated the particular combination of physical coordination, spatial awareness, quick decision-making, and psychological resilience that carrier fighter aviation required, completed the full curriculum and reached frontline status. The filter was ruthless and deliberate, and its product was extraordinarily good. But the filter had a throughput. It could only graduate so many pilots per year, regardless of how many candidates entered the initial phase. And the operational losses of 1942 and 1943 were consuming pilots faster than the filter could replace them. The Japanese Navy's response to the pilot shortage was to accelerate the training pipeline, to reduce the time allocated to each training phase, to lower the qualification thresholds, to move pilots to frontline units before they had accumulated the hours that previous generations of aviators had considered the minimum for competent carrier operations. This was not a decision taken lightly. The officers who made it understood what they were doing. They were choosing between a smaller number of fully trained pilots and a larger number of partially trained ones, and they chose the latter because the operational tempo demanded bodies in cockpits. The consequence, predictable and predicted by at least some of those officers, was a progressive decline in the average quality of the pilot corps that exactly mirrored the progressive decline in the Zero's qualitative edge over Allied fighters. The zero-sum character of this decline is what makes it so historically striking. The Zero was an aircraft whose best qualities were accessible only to skilled pilots: the extraordinary maneuverability at low speed, the ability to execute precision gunnery at the margins of the flight envelope, the tactical creativity that turned the aircraft's performance characteristics into genuine combat advantages. Less experienced pilots flying the same aircraft accessed a smaller fraction of its potential. They were capable of flying it, in the mechanical sense, but they could not fly it the way that Nishizawa and Sakai flew it the way it had been designed to be flown. In the implicit understanding between Horikoshi's engineering team and the Navy's pilot selection and training culture that an exceptional aircraft would be operated by exceptional people, the contrast with American pilot training is instructive, though the comparison has to be made carefully to avoid misleading simplification. American naval aviator training was thorough, systematic, and by the standards of the early Pacific War, somewhat less selective than Japanese training in the sense that its goal was to produce competent combat pilots in volume, rather than exceptional combat pilots in small numbers. American training doctrine was, in this sense, a product of the same industrial logic that characterized American war production, generally the design of systems for throughput and standardization, rather than for the peak performance of rare individuals. As the war progressed, and American aircraft quality improved to the point where competent pilots could defeat excellent Japanese pilots, the American training model's emphasis on volume proved to be exactly the right choice for the kind of war the Pacific had become. Individual Japanese aces continued to perform at extraordinary levels, even as the overall quality of the pilot corps declined. They flew better aircraft. The A6M variants were genuine improvements over the early war Model 21 in several key performance areas. They applied combat experience and tactical creativity that no amount of training alone could replicate. And they occasionally achieved results against Allied formations that, evaluated in isolation, could be mistaken for evidence that the Zero's competitive effectiveness had not fundamentally changed. But these individual performances were increasingly anomalous, exceptional men extracting the best from an excellent aircraft in a system that was no longer generating enough such men to sustain the operational rates the war required. The loss of Nishizawa himself, late in 1944, illustrates the systemic problem with a terrible clarity. He was killed not in aerial combat, not in the kind of engagement in which his skills gave him every advantage, but as a passenger on a transport aircraft that was shot down by American fighters. The man who may have been the finest Zero pilot in the history of the type ended his life as cargo because the demands of the operational situation had placed him on a transport flight rather than in a cockpit. There is something in that fact that resists easy categorization. It is not quite tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter and more systemic, the illustration of what happens when a system built around exceptional individuals reaches a point where those individuals are being consumed faster than the system can account for, until even the most exceptional are simply caught in the general flow of events. The aces of the Zero era were not monuments. They were men, with the specific skills and limitations that men possess, flying a specific aircraft in a specific historical moment, under pressures that accumulated as the war continued in directions that the opening campaigns had not made inevitable. They deserve the precise kind of acknowledgement that their own accounts tended to model, clear-eyed, specific, without inflation. They flew extraordinarily well. They flew a machine that rewarded extraordinary skill. And then the machine and the system around it met the moment when extraordinary skill was no longer sufficient to close the gap that had opened between what Japan could sustain and what its opponents could produce. Chapter 12. The Pacific Turns. By the summer of 1943, The Pacific War had acquired a rhythm that was new, not the breathless forward momentum of the opening campaigns, but the slower, grinding rhythm of contested attrition over specific objectives. The island-hopping strategy that American commanders were developing in the Central and Southwestern Pacific was not primarily a contest between aircraft types, though aircraft were central to every engagement. It was a contest between logistical systems, between the ability of two industrial civilizations to sustain offensive operations across thousands of kilometers of open ocean simultaneously. In that contest, the Zero's virtues were increasingly irrelevant and its vulnerabilities increasingly decisive. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, remembered in American accounts as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name given to it by the pilots who flew in it, and that the historical record does not do much to contradict, was the most consequential single engagement in the Zero's later wartime history. The Japanese mobile force had assembled the largest carrier striking force that Japan could muster by that point in the war. 9 carriers, with a combined air group of more than 450 aircraft, the majority of them Zeros of the latest A6M variant. Against them, Admiral Mark Mitchell's Task Force 58 deployed 15 carriers with more than 900 aircraft, including large numbers of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters that had been specifically designed and trained to address the Zero's capabilities. The Japanese plan required their carrier aircraft to attack the American force, land at Guam to rearm and refuel, attack again, and return to their carriers, a complex shuttle mission that depended on several elements working in coordination. The American force had detailed intelligence about the Japanese approach, allowing Mitchell to position his ships and prepare his fighters with a clarity of tactical situation that the Japanese commanders did not expect and had not prepared for. When the Japanese attack waves arrived, they encountered a defense that was organized, numerous, and flying aircraft specifically adapted to defeat the approach profile that Zero and Zero variant pilots were using. The results were, by any analytical measure, catastrophic for Japanese naval aviation. In a single day of aerial engagement, Japanese carrier air groups lost the equivalent of months of replacement pilot production. The specific numbers vary by source, but the direction of the evidence is not in dispute. Several hundred Japanese aircraft were destroyed, compared to a much smaller American loss. The Hellcat pilots who flew that day were flying an aircraft that was faster than the Zero at every altitude above low level, that could survive a hit the Zero could not, that had firepower calibrated to the destruction of lightly built aircraft with unprotected fuel tanks, and that they had been trained to fly against the specific tactical profile that Japanese aviators had been employing since 1941. The Zero pilots who flew at the Philippine Sea were not all inexperienced. Some of them were veterans with years of combat behind them. But many of the replacement pilots who had been rushed through accelerated training programs were encountering the Hellcat for the first time in combat, with none of the theoretical preparation that earlier generation pilots had received for the specific performance characteristics of their American opponents. The tactical mismatch was compounded by the institutional knowledge mismatch experienced American pilots who had been briefed extensively on the Zero's capabilities against replacement Japanese pilots who had been briefed insufficiently on the Hellcats. The information asymmetry that had favored Japan in the opening months had reversed so completely that it was now favoring the opposition in roughly the same degree. The loss of the pilot cadre at Philippine Sea was, in a practical sense, irreversible within the remaining timeline of the war. The training pipeline could not produce, in the months remaining before the war's end, pilots trained to the standard that the Zero demanded for effective operation against Hellcats. The carriers that had survived the battle were still present, still capable in the material sense of launching aircraft. But the aircraft they could launch were increasingly flown by men whose training had been so compressed that they arrived at their first combat engagement with a fraction of the hours and skills that their predecessors had possessed 3 years earlier. The Zero was the same aircraft. The pilots were not the same pilots. The strategic geography of the Pacific was shifting in ways that compounded every one of these problems. As American forces established airfields progressively closer to the Japanese home islands, the reach of American land-based aviation, including the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which operated at altitudes and speeds that made it genuinely difficult for the Zero to intercept, effectively extended over territories that Japanese air defenses had previously not needed to defend. The Zero, designed to operate offensively at medium altitude over oceanic distances, was being asked to perform high-altitude interception missions, for which its engine was not optimized, and its rate of climb above 6,000 meters was inadequate. The defensive missions it was increasingly assigned were different in character from the offensive missions it had been designed for, and the mismatch between the aircraft's design and its operational requirements was widening with each month. The industrial dimension of the Pacific's turning point is worth examining with some precision because it is the dimension that military history sometimes underweights in favor of the more cinematically available narrative of individual engagements. American aircraft production in 1944 reached a total that Japanese production could not approach, not because Japanese engineers were less capable or Japanese workers less diligent, but because the American industrial base was larger, better supplied with raw materials, less disrupted by bombing, and organized around production methods that prioritized throughput over craft. The American aircraft industry was producing Hellcats, Corsairs, Lightnings, and Mustangs in numbers that allowed the replacement of losses quickly enough that experienced units could maintain their operational tempo. The Japanese aircraft industry was producing Zeros and Zero variants in numbers that were diminishing relative to requirement. There is a moment in the trajectory of a technological competition where the side that has been falling behind passes through the zone of approximate parity into the zone of clear disadvantage. In the air war over the Pacific, that moment was somewhere in the middle of 1943, after the Guadalcanal campaign had ended, after the Hellcat had entered service, after the tactical intelligence derived from the Akutan Zero had been fully distributed to American fighter units. Before that moment, the result of any individual engagement was genuinely uncertain, dependent on pilot skill, tactical judgment, and situational factors that neither side could fully control. After it, the structural advantage had shifted, and the structural advantage was reinforced by every new Hellcat that arrived and every experienced Zero pilot who was not replaced. The Pacific did not turn in a single day or a single battle. It turned through a series of engagements, each one slightly more unfavorable than the last, each one consuming a slightly larger share of the experienced human capital that the Japanese Naval Air Force could not replenish. The Zero was present in all of them, still flying, still occasionally producing individual performances of great skill and courage, still representing the best that Japanese carrier-based aviation could produce given the constraints under which it was operating. But the aircraft that had ruled the opening of the Pacific War was now flying in a context that no longer supported the conditions its dominance had required. The rain that made the runway on Akutan so treacherous on the 4th of July, 1942, the angle at which a specific aircraft came to rest in a specific bog on a specific island. These things had begun a process that the summer of 1944 was completing. The Zero's greatest chapter was behind it. What remained was the question of what it would do with the time it had left. Chapter 13. The Weight of Desperation. There is a specific moment in the life of any military system when the logic of its original design becomes insufficient for the demands being placed upon it, when the gap between what was planned and what is required becomes so wide that the system begins to be used in ways its designers never envisioned and would not have sanctioned. For the Zero, that moment arrived gradually through 1943, and then, with accelerating clarity, through 1944. The aircraft had been built as an instrument of precise, skilled offensive action, a tool for men trained to an extraordinary standard, operating within a doctrine refined by years of operational experience. What the war was now asking of it was something different, something heavier, something that the men who had built it and the men who had flown it in its best years would have recognized immediately as the signal that the original calculation had run out of room. The context that produced this shift was not a single decision or a single battle. It was the accumulated pressure of a war that had not ended when Japan's strategic planners had needed it to end. The opening campaigns had been conceived on the assumption that decisive early results would force a negotiated settlement before American industrial capacity could be brought fully to bear. That assumption had been wrong. By 1944, American industrial production was delivering aircraft, ships, and supplies at volumes that Japanese planners had projected were years away. The carriers at Philippine Sea that Hellcat pilots flew from were not improvisations. They were the product of a production expansion that had been running at maximum rate since 1942, building on an industrial base that was simply, structurally, larger and more flexible than anything Japan had available to match it. The Zero variant designated the A6M7, and the broader category of modifications applied to late-war Zero production reflected the aircraft's adaptation to a fundamentally defensive strategic posture. Where the early variants had been optimized for range, offensive maneuverability, and the support of carrier strike operations, the later variants increasingly incorporated modifications aimed at improving climb rate and high-altitude performance for the interception role that the home island defense now required. The Sake engine, in its later variants, received injection systems and supercharger modifications intended to improve performance at the altitudes where B-29 formations flew their strikes. These modifications produced real improvements, measured against the baseline of the original Sakai-12. Measured against the performance of the aircraft they were intended to intercept, the improvements were insufficient. The home island defense missions that Zero pilots were flying by late 1944 were not the missions the aircraft had been built for. The B-29, which began reaching Japan from bases in the Marianas, flew at altitudes between 7,000 and 9,000 meters above the service ceiling at which the Zero's engine produced its best performance, in the altitude band where the aircraft's climb rate and high-altitude maneuverability were at their weakest. Japanese interception doctrine required fighters to climb to altitude before the bombers arrived, which in turn required accurate early warning, a system that was being progressively degraded by the same American air superiority that was making the interceptions necessary in the first place. Pilots who scrambled late, climbing hard in thin air with aging engines burning fuels of declining octane quality, often reached the approach altitudes with performance margins that made effective interception genuinely difficult. The engineering responses to this problem included proposals for more powerful engines, improved superchargers, and ultimately the successor aircraft that Mitsubishi and other manufacturers had been developing since the middle of the war. None of these arrived in operational quantities in time to change the situation materially. The Repu, which was designed specifically to address the limitations that late-war operational requirements had exposed, remained in development and limited testing through to the war's end, delayed by the same combination of engine development problems and production disruption that was affecting every aspect of Japanese aviation at the time. The Zero, in its late-war variants, was being asked to do a job for which it had not been designed, with an engine that was being pushed beyond its original design parameters, maintained by ground crews working with diminishing supplies of the materials and parts the aircraft required. The fuel situation alone tells much of the story. Japanese aviation fuel quality declined significantly through 1944 and 1945 as the supply of high-octane fuel was disrupted by the progressive loss of refining capacity and the interdiction of shipping routes that brought petroleum products from the southern resource areas. The Sakai engine had been designed and calibrated for specific fuel grades. As those grades became unavailable and substitute fuels of lower octane rating were used, the engine's performance degraded in ways that were measurable and significant reduced power output, increased susceptibility to detonation under high load conditions, reduced reliability and service life. The Zero was carrying the weight of its entire supply chain's collapse in its engine performance, and the pilots flying it could feel the difference every time they pushed the throttle forward and did not get the response they had trained to expect. Maintenance had always been one of the Zero's genuine operational challenges. The aluminium alloys that made it so light required careful handling and periodic inspection for the stress corrosion that the alloy's chemistry made inevitable. In the early war period, When skilled ground crews with adequate tools and materials maintained frontline aircraft in established facilities, this had been managed well. By 1944, the maintenance situation at many operational units had deteriorated sharply. Trained ground crew were being drawn into the expanding military manpower demand. Spare parts, which had flowed freely from Nagoya and Ota in the early years, were increasingly difficult to obtain in the quantities the operational tempo required. Aircraft that were repairable in principle were written off because the parts and the time to repair them were not available. The operational readiness rates that Japanese carrier and land-based units could sustain fell as a consequence, which reduced the effective size of the available force below even the diminished production numbers. The human dimension of this deterioration was felt most acutely by the men who were asked to keep flying in conditions they could assess with perfect clarity. The Zero pilots of 1944 and 1945 were not, as a group, comparable to the men who had opened the Pacific War 3 years earlier. Some individuals of extraordinary skill and experience remained men who had survived by a combination of ability, judgment, and the particular fortune that attaches to some people in dangerous situations and not others. But the average experience level of the pilot force had declined, to the point where the Zero's demanding flight characteristics were themselves a hazard, an aircraft that rewarded extraordinary pilots and punished ordinary ones. Being flown, with increasing frequency, by pilots who were below the ordinary standard the aircraft had always implicitly assumed. The structural problem was visible at every level to anyone who examined it clearly. The Zero had been one component of a system, and the system was failing not in the aircraft itself, which was still being built to acceptable standards, and not in the design, which remained sound within its original parameters, but in the human and material infrastructure that translated those standards and that design into effective military power. An aircraft is never better than the pilot who flies it, the fuel that powers it, the ground crew that maintains it, and the supply chain that keeps all of those things functioning. By late 1944, every one of those supporting elements was under pressure that the Zero's original design specifications had not anticipated and could not compensate for. What the Japanese Naval Air Command did in response to this systemic deterioration is the subject of the next chapter, and it is a subject that requires the same care and specificity that the Zero's entire history has. Demanded. It was a response shaped by genuine desperation, by an accurate reading of the material situation, and by a set of cultural and institutional values that had deep roots in the military tradition from which the Zero and its pilots had both emerged. It was not a response that any participant in the war wanted, or that any humane analysis of the situation could endorse. It was the response of an institution that had run out of the conventional options and was reaching for the only remaining tool it believed it had. The aircraft that Jiro Horikoshi had built in defiance of engineering impossibility was about to be asked to do something that no engineering had intended and no design specification had prepared it for. Chapter 14. The Pilots Who Did Not Return. The word kamikaze, in its literal translation from Japanese, means divine wind. It refers, historically, to the typhoons that twice, in the 13th century, destroyed Mongol invasion fleets approaching Japan, storms that Japanese tradition interpreted as evidence of divine protection. When the term was applied, in the autumn of 1944, to a new category of air operation, the choice of name was deliberate. It was meant to locate the practice within a tradition of national preservation, to frame what was being asked of young men as continuous with the deepest narrative of Japanese historical identity. The framing was, as all such framings are, an attempt to make bearable what clear-eyed human assessment would otherwise have found unbearable. The formal establishment of what the Japanese Navy called the Special Attack Corps began in October of 1944, in the context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships involved, and a battle that represented Japan's last strategic opportunity to significantly reverse the course of the Pacific War. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, assessed the conventional air resources available to him against the scale of the American naval force that had assembled for the Leyte landing and reached a conclusion that the operational records preserve with uncomfortable clarity. His conventional air forces were insufficient, in numbers and in pilot quality, to achieve the results that the situation required through conventional attack methods. The losses required to achieve significant damage to the American carrier force through conventional dive bombing and torpedo attack, given the anti-aircraft defenses and the fighter cover that American carriers now deployed, would exhaust his force before the mission was accomplished. An unconventional approach was authorized. The Zero was the primary aircraft type used in special attack operations, for reasons that were partly logistical and partly operational. It was the most numerous aircraft type available at the operational units tasked with the missions. Its range, even in the late war period with fuel quality declining, was sufficient to reach American carrier formations from the available Philippine bases. Its load-carrying capacity allowed it to carry a bomb of sufficient size to cause serious damage to a ship's flight deck and the aircraft and fuel stored below it. And there was, at the level of cultural symbolism that the framing of the operation relied upon, something fitting about the aircraft that had opened Japan's war being present at the desperate attempt to alter its course. None of these practical considerations make the operations easier to assess in human terms. They simply explain the mechanism. The pilots who flew these missions were not, in most cases, the veterans of the early Pacific campaigns. Those men were, as has been described, increasingly scarce. The pilots selected for special attack units were disproportionately drawn from the later training cohorts, young men who had entered the training pipeline after the war had already turned against Japan, who had been trained quickly and incompletely to a standard insufficient for conventional carrier fighter operations against Hellcats and Corsairs, but who could be trained to fly a fixed route to a large target. Some were volunteers, in the specific sense that they had indicated willingness when the unit commanders solicited nominations. Some were selected by other means. The historical record on the precise mechanics of selection at individual units is uneven, and the accounts left by survivors of adjacent units who were not selected describe a range of experiences that resist any single characterization. What is documented clearly is that the operations caused genuine damage to American naval forces in a way that conventional Japanese air attacks in the same period could not have achieved. The first organized special attack operations at Leyte Gulf struck American escort carriers with a success rate that shocked naval observers on both sides. The escort carrier Streetlow was sunk. Multiple other ships were damaged. The damage was real, the tactical effect was real, and the shock to American naval command of an attack method for which existing anti-aircraft doctrine had not fully prepared them was also real. None of this represents an endorsement of the practice. It is simply an accurate account of what the operational record shows. The American response to the threat developed progressively through the remainder of the war. Combat air patrol doctrine was modified specifically to address the attack profile. Anti-aircraft fire patterns were revised. The introduction of the variable time proximity fuse on anti-aircraft shells, which detonated the shell when it passed near an aircraft rather than requiring a direct hit, significantly improved the defensive effectiveness of shipboard anti-aircraft batteries against the low-altitude approach profiles that special attack aircraft typically used. The defensive improvements did not eliminate the threat. Special attack aircraft continued to inflict damage and casualties on American naval forces through to the final months of the war. But the improvements substantially increased the attrition rate among attacking aircraft and reduced the probability that any individual mission would result in the damage its planners intended. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945, special attack operations had become the primary mode of Japanese air attack against American naval forces. The scale of operations at Okinawa exceeded everything that had come before thousands of sorties over the course of the campaign, drawn from every available aircraft type and every available pilot. The Zero was still prominent among them, carrying bombs toward American ships in the waters around Okinawa, while American fighters and anti-aircraft fire took their toll on the attacking formations. The damage inflicted on American naval forces at Okinawa was the most extensive suffered by the United States Navy in any operation of the entire Pacific War. The human cost on the Japanese side was proportionate in its own terrible way. Young men, many of them barely trained, flying aircraft in conditions that even the most skilled pilots of 3 years earlier would have found extreme. The moral weight of this chapter in the Zero's history does not resolve easily into any simple framing. It is not a story of fanaticism, in the sense of mindless commitment to an ideology, though ideology was present in the framing that military and political leaders provided. It is not a story of cowardice, clearly. It is, in the most honest assessment available, a story of what happens when an institution that has run out of options within its conventional framework reaches for the most extreme option remaining, and does so in a way that transfers the final cost to the youngest and least experienced members of the force. The veterans who might have refused, had they been asked, were mostly gone. The men who were asked had not yet accumulated the experience and authority that refusal requires. Jiro Horikoshi was in Nagoya while these operations were occurring, working on aircraft designs that he understood would not arrive in time to change the war's outcome, living with the knowledge that the aircraft bearing his name was being used in a way that his original specification had never contemplated, and that his private convictions about the purpose of engineering found deeply troubling. The historical record of his private reactions to the special attack operations is limited, but his later writings describe his feelings about the war's direction with a directness that is itself unusual in the literature of wartime Japanese engineering. He had built the Zero to be the best carrier fighter the Navy's specification could produce. He had not built it for this. The distinction mattered to him, and the historical record should preserve it. The special attack operations ended with the end of the Pacific War in August of 1945. The aircraft that had been designated for the final defensive operations, including enormous numbers of Zeros and late-model variants held in reserve for the expected Allied invasion of the home islands, were never used. The ceasefire that followed the events of August 6th and 9th and the subsequent Imperial broadcast reached the air units before the final operations could be executed. The pilots waiting at their dispersal fields for orders that never came experienced what must have been, in that moment, the specific and complete relief of men who had genuinely not expected to survive the week. Some of them left accounts. What they describe is not triumph and not quite grief, something that resists easy naming, as the end of an ordeal that was also the end of a purpose tends to produce in the people who have lived through it. Chapter 15. The Machines That Survived. The end of the Pacific War in August of 1945 produced, in the weeks and months that followed, a reckoning with material that was unique in the history of aviation. More than 10,000 Zeros had been built. Of that number, the vast majority had been destroyed in combat, operational accidents, or the systematic demolition that Japanese military units were ordered to carry out in the surrender period to prevent their capture. The Americans who arrived at Japanese air bases in the occupation weeks found fields lined with aircraft that had been rendered inoperable, engines smashed, control surfaces cut, airframes pushed into drainage ditches. The Zero that had ruled the Pacific sky for 4 years was, by the autumn of 1945, present mostly as wreckage. A very small number of airworthy or near-airworthy examples survived the surrender period intact. Some were captured by American forces at various points during the war and transferred to test facilities in the United States. The Akutan Zero was the most famous of these, but it was not unique. Others survived in Japan itself because they had been at remote bases or in repair facilities when the surrender order reached their units, and the order to destroy them had not been carried out completely or at all. Still others were assembled in the post-war years from salvaged components, a process that required the skills of both aviation engineers and forensic archaeologists, working from surviving technical documents, parts from multiple airframes, and the institutional memory of the men who had built and maintained the aircraft. The process of locating surviving Zeros and restoring them to displayable or flyable condition has continued, with varying levels of success and controversy, from the 1950s through to the present day. The challenges are considerable at every level. The extra super duralumin alloy that gave the Zero its extraordinary weight-to-strength ratio is prone to the intergranular corrosion that was always its principal maintenance challenge, and an airframe that has been sitting in tropical humidity for decades, or submerged in salt water, or exposed to the chemical environment of a Pacific jungle, has typically been corroding for longer than it was in active service. Restoration work requires the careful assessment of every structural member, the replacement of components too far corroded to be safe, and the sourcing of original or period-correct materials that become harder to find with every passing decade. The Nakajima Sakai engine that powered the Production Zero presents its own preservation challenges. It was a sophisticated piece of radial engine engineering for its era, and running examples are extremely rare. The engines in most displayed aircraft are static replicas or have been replaced with modern engines of similar external dimensions. A genuinely airworthy Sakai, in the condition required for repeated flight demonstrations, requires a level of maintenance expertise that was once common among the men who had worked on these engines in operational service, and that has become increasingly rare as those men have aged and passed on. The institutional knowledge of how to maintain these engines, the particular techniques, the tolerances, the failure modes and their remedies, was embedded in the generation of ground crew who served with the Naval Air Force, and it has been transferring, with difficulty and incompleteness, to the small community of specialists who work on surviving examples today. The museums and collections that hold Zero aircraft represent a genuinely diverse geography, from the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, which holds the A6M recovered and restored to display condition, to the Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, which operates one of the very small number of aircraft that can actually fly, to multiple museums and memorials in Japan itself, where the Zero occupies a specific and contested place in the national memory. The contestation is real and important. In Japan, the Zero is simultaneously a symbol of technical achievement, evidence of what Japanese engineering could produce under extreme constraints, and an object whose association with the war, with the special attack operations, and with the broader catastrophe of Japanese militarism makes uncomplicated celebration inappropriate. The conversations around the Zero in Japan are different in character from the conversations in America or Britain or Australia, because the weight of what the aircraft represents is distributed differently across those different national memories. The wreck recovery operations that have produced some of the surviving aircraft for restoration carry their own complexities. Zeros have been recovered from the jungles of various Pacific islands, from lagoons and harbors across the Pacific Theater, and from the waters surrounding Japan. Each recovery operation potentially produces not just an aircraft, but human remains, the pilots who did not return from the missions on which those aircraft were lost. The careful separation of the material and the human, the treatment of wreck sites with the respect that places of death require, regardless of the nationality or military affiliation of the dead, has been handled with varying degrees of care and consistency across the decades of recovery activity. The best of these operations have been conducted with meticulous attention to both the technical and the ethical dimensions. Others have not. The restoration of the Planes of Fame Zero to flying condition is a story that illustrates in miniature the broader challenges of keeping this history materially present. The aircraft was assembled and restored through a process that took years, drew on the expertise of engineers, historians, and craftsmen, and produced a result that allows audiences at air shows to see the Zero moving through the air as it was designed to move, the distinctive sound of its engine, the precise quality of its turns, the visual impression that the aircraft makes in flight that no photograph or museum display can fully replicate. The people who have seen it fly and who have spoken about the experience consistently remark on a quality that is difficult to articulate, precisely something about the way the aircraft moves that conveys, in a way that static display cannot, what it actually was. Not a symbol, not a relic. An aircraft, a specific, detailed, material object that people designed and built and flew with all the precision and weight that those words carry. The question of what the preserved Zeros represent, what we are preserving when we preserve them, and for whom, is one that every aviation museum grapples with, and that the Zero raises with particular acuteness because of the weight of its historical associations. They are not monuments to a cause, they are not endorsements of the institutions that created and operated them. They are, at their best, three-dimensional primary sources, objects that carry within their structure the specific engineering decisions of a specific moment, the material evidence of a specific set of problems and solutions, the physical record of capabilities that shaped an enormous swath of human experience in the middle of the 20th century. Preserving them is, in this sense, continuous with the obligation to preserve any primary historical source, not to celebrate what it represents, but to maintain the ability to encounter it directly, without the mediation of secondary reconstruction. There are fewer than 10 airworthy or near-airworthy Zeros remaining in the world as of the mid-21st century's opening decades. The number is declining rather than increasing each year, brings the possibility of an accident, a deterioration beyond economic repair, a decision by a collector or institution that the cost of continued airworthiness exceeds what the aircraft can justify. The attrition of time is, in its own way, as thorough as the attrition of the Pacific War, though gentler and far slower. The Zeros that remain in museums, restored to static display, we are more numerous, perhaps 30 to 50 identifiable aircraft in various states of completeness. But each of them is also in a continuous slow dialogue with entropy, requiring active maintenance and preservation effort to remain present. The physical survival of the Zero is, ultimately, the material foundation of everything that historical understanding of the aircraft rests upon. The documents can describe it. The accounts of the men who flew it can convey aspects of what it was. The technical analyses can reconstruct its performance envelope from the data that survive. But none of these is quite the same as the object itself, the actual geometry of the wing, the actual weight of the control stick, the actual sound of the Sake engine at full power. Preserving that contact with the actual object is a serious responsibility, and the people who carry it in museums, in restoration workshops, in the careful community of aviation historians and practitioners who keep this knowledge alive are engaged in work whose importance is proportionate to the rarity of what they are protecting. Chapter 16. What the Allies Learned. The process by which the Allied powers understood the Zero, first misread it, then encountered it, then studied it, then defeated it, is one of the more instructive case studies in the history of military intelligence and technological adaptation. It is instructive not because it is a story of simple failure followed by simple success, but because it shows, with unusual clarity, the specific stages through which a technological surprise is processed and answered the stages of dismissal, encounter, analysis, adaptation, and eventual mastery that characterize every episode in which one military power confronts a weapon it did not expect from an adversary it had underestimated. The dismissal stage has been described in earlier chapters, the intelligence reports from Chenault, the dismissal of those reports by American analysts, the structural bias toward assuming that Japanese aviation could not have produced something genuinely ahead of Western equivalents. That dismissal was not unique to the Zero. It was part of a broader pattern of perception that shaped Allied pre-war assessments of Japanese military capability across multiple domains. The perception was not malicious, it was the product of an incomplete understanding of what Japanese industry, training systems, and institutional culture had produced through the 1930s, but it was consequential in a way that malicious misperception would equally have been. The encounter stage, beginning on the 7th of December, 1941, had the character of a controlled experiment in the worst possible sense, controlled by the Zero's operational characteristics, with Allied pilots as the experimental subjects. The results of the early encounter were collected in the debrief reports, the after-action analyses, and the carefully written accounts of the pilots who survived long enough to understand what they had encountered. Those accounts were fed into intelligence systems that were, by late 1942, functioning with greater urgency and greater thoroughness than the pre-war assessments had displayed. The debriefs of American volunteer group pilots from China, the analysis of early Pacific campaign engagements, the technical examination of wreckage, all of this was coming together in analytical organizations that were learning to treat the Zero as a specific technical problem rather than an ethnic stereotype. The Akutan Zero accelerated the analysis stage in the precise way that a primary physical source accelerates any analytical process. Before Akutan, the analysis of the Zero was necessarily inferential, working from performance data observed in combat, from dimensions estimated by measuring photographs, from materials composition inferred from the behavior of structural fragments. After Akutan, the analysis was direct. Every dimension was measured, every material was tested. Every system was disassembled, documented, and examined by engineers who knew exactly what questions the operational experience had raised. The resulting technical intelligence document, formally designated by the United States Navy as the Report of the Zero's Evaluation at Naval Air Station San Diego, was the most comprehensive technical analysis of any enemy aircraft produced by any Allied power at any point in the war. The adaptation stage that followed involved every layer of the American military aviation system simultaneously. Aircraft designers incorporated the specific findings into new designs. Tacticians codified the engagement rules that the Zero's vulnerability at high speed implied. Training commands built the THAC weave and the high-speed diving attack into every fighter pilot's basic curriculum. Intelligence briefings updated the picture that pilots arriving in the Pacific Theater received about what they would encounter. Each of these adaptations built on the others. Better aircraft made the tactics more effective. Better tactics made the aircraft's specific advantages matter more. Better training made the tactics available to a larger fraction of the pilot force, and better intelligence made all of these things available to the right people in the right amount of time. The mastery stage is represented most clearly by the Philippine Sea engagement, where the combination of better aircraft, better tactics, and better informed pilots met a Japanese force whose own capability trajectory was moving in the opposite direction. But mastery in this context does not mean that the Zero became a trivial adversary overnight. Individual Zero pilots of high skill, flying with tactical awareness and in favorable conditions, remained capable of defeating Hellcat pilots throughout the remainder of the war. The performance gap was real and widening, but performance gaps in aerial combat are never so large that skill and judgment cannot occasionally compensate for them. What changed at Philippine Sea was not the absolute capability of the best Zero pilots. It was the systematic shift in the average engagement outcome, the statistical drift of the contest in a direction that the structural factors had made almost inevitable. There is a dimension to what the Allies learned from the Zero that goes beyond the tactical and technical. The encounter with the Zero forced a recalibration of institutional assumptions about the relationship between national industrial capacity, engineering culture, and military technological achievement. The analytical failure before Pearl Harbor was not simply a failure to read specific intelligence reports correctly. It was a failure of the underlying framework through which those reports were being interpreted, a framework that assumed a tight correlation between a nation's overall economic size and the quality of its military technology. The Zero demonstrated, in the most unambiguous possible way, that a motivated engineering community working within a serious institutional framework could produce world-class military technology regardless of aggregate industrial scale. That lesson was absorbed, imperfectly but genuinely, into the analytical frameworks that American intelligence applied to subsequent technological assessments. The tactical lessons that American pilots derived from fighting the Zero also had lasting institutional effects. The THAC weave became a standard element of American naval fighter tactics, taught for decades after the war ended. The emphasis on energy management, on using altitude and speed as primary tactical resources rather than maneuverability, became a foundational principle of American fighter tactics that persisted through the jet age, influenced the development of every subsequent generation of American fighter doctrine. The dissimilar air combat training program that the United States Navy established in the 1960s, which trained naval aviators to fight against aircraft with different performance characteristics than their own, had its intellectual origins in the recognition derived directly from Pacific War experience against the Zero, that a fighter pilot, trained only against opponents of similar characteristics, was incompletely prepared. The aircraft design lessons were equally persistent. The Hellcat was the direct expression of what the Zero analysis had taught American designers, and the Hellcat's performance at Philippine Sea was the validation of those lessons. But the longer arc influence extended into the design philosophies that shaped post-war American fighter development. The balance between speed, climb, and maneuverability. The trade-off between structural weight and agility. The critical importance of pilot protection alongside aircraft performance. All of these were questions that the Zero encounter had sharpened and that the post-war design community carried forward explicitly. The aircraft's influence on American aviation extended far beyond the war in which it participated. The most honest summary of what the Allies learned from the Zero is that they learned, at considerable cost and with considerable delay, the specific thing they should have known before the first engagement. That the aircraft was exactly as good as the evidence available before the war had indicated, and that the failure to act on that evidence was a failure of institutional culture rather than a failure of available information. The remedy for that specific failure, the organizational and analytical reforms that made American intelligence assessment more rigorous and more humble about the limits of its own assumptions, was one of the most important and least visible consequences of the Pacific War. It was the kind of learning that does not appear in battle casualty tables or production statistics, but that shapes the institutional competence of military organizations for decades after the events that produced it. Chapter 17. The Ghost in the Machine, Legacy and Memory. History does not end with the last engagement. It continues in the accounts of the survivors, in the arguments of the historians, in the museum displays and the restoration workshops, in the films and the books and the documentaries. The Zero has had, since 1945, a historical afterlife of unusual richness and complexity, partly because the aircraft itself is so technically compelling, partly because the war in which it fought was so consequential, and partly because the questions it raises about engineering, military power, and the relationship between technical excellence and human tragedy are questions that do not become easier with the passage of time. The historical literature on the Zero in Japan has moved, over the 8 decades since the war's end, through several distinct phases. The immediate post-war period produced accounts shaped by the experience of defeat, often focused on the human cost of the war rather than the technical achievements of the aircraft, and operating under the constraints of an occupation-era censorship and a broader national process of reckoning with the war that made straightforward celebration of military equipment inappropriate. From the 1960s onward, as the immediate weight of defeat lifted somewhat, and as the generation of pilots and engineers who had participated in the Zero's development and operational career began to age, into the stage of life where retrospective accounts are written, a substantial body of memoir and technical history appeared. Horikoshi's own memoirs are among the most valuable of these precise, honest, technically detailed, and engaged with the moral dimensions of his work in a way that many engineering memoirs are not. In the United States and Britain and Australia, the Zero entered a historical narrative that was shaped by the specific ways in which those nations had experienced the war. For American audiences, the Zero was primarily associated with Pearl Harbor, the shocking arrival of a superior Japanese weapon in a context where American confidence had not prepared for superiority. The subsequent defeat of the Zero became, in this narrative, part of the larger story of American industrial and military mobilization, the story of how a nation surprised and initially set back eventually brought its full capacities to bear and prevailed. That narrative is not false, but it compresses the complexity of what actually happened in ways that leave important things out. The Zero was not defeated by industrial capacity alone. It was defeated by a combination of industrial capacity, analytical intelligence, tactical adaptation, and the progressive exhaustion of the Japanese pilot corps, and understanding all of those factors is necessary for understanding why the outcome was what it was. Hayao Miyazaki's animated film about Jiro Horikoshi, released in 2013, introduced the Zero and its designer to a global audience that had limited prior exposure to either. The film was controversial in Japan, precisely because of what it chose to emphasize Horikoshi's dream of beautiful aircraft, his love of flight as a pure engineering achievement, the tragedy of a man whose finest creation became an instrument of a war he could not prevent. Some Japanese critics argued that the film aestheticized Japanese militarism. Others argued that it was exactly the kind of engagement with the war's human dimensions that Japanese cultural production needed more of. The film itself, characteristically for Miyazaki's work, did not resolve these tensions so much as hold them in suspension, presenting the Zero as simultaneously beautiful and terrible, an expression of human aspiration and an instrument of human destruction, in a way that neither simple condemnation nor simple celebration can accommodate. The place of the Zero in contemporary Japanese national memory is part of a broader, ongoing conversation about how Japan understands its 20th century history. That conversation is complicated by genuine disagreements about historical responsibility, by the political pressures that attach to any public engagement with wartime symbolism, and by the generational distance that has accumulated between the present and the events themselves. The Zero appears in this conversation as a contested object claimed by those who see it as evidence of Japanese excellence and resilience, resisted by those who associate it with the militarist project that produced the war, and examined with more careful historical nuance by the growing community of scholars and curators who are trying to understand what it actually was rather than what the competing symbolic claims require it to be. The technical legacy of the Zero within Japanese aviation is more straightforwardly accessible, though it too carries complexities. The post-war Japanese aviation industry, which was prohibited from producing military aircraft during the occupation period, and that resumed aircraft development only gradually through the 1950s and 1960s, built on the engineering traditions and institutional knowledge that had produced the Zero. The YS-11 turboprop transport aircraft of the 1960s, on whose design team Horikoshi himself worked, was a direct expression of that continuity, an application of the engineering discipline and precision that had characterized the Zero's development to the very different requirements of a post-war civil aviation market. The engineers who built it had, in many cases, been trained or mentored by men who had worked on the Zero, and the methodological continuities were explicit in the design documentation. The Zero's influence on global fighter design is less direct than its influence on tactics and intelligence, but it is traceable. The specific problems that the Zero posed, the combination of range, maneuverability, and lightweight that its designers had achieved by making specific and conscious trade-offs, became reference points in post-war aircraft design debates. The question of how much structural weight is worth paying for pilot protection, which the Zero's design had answered in one direction and which the Pacific War had then answered in another direction, became a persistent theme in post-war fighter design philosophy. The answer that most post-war air forces settled on more protection at the cost of some agility reflected the specific lesson that the Zero's operational history had taught. The ghost in the machine is, in the end, the design decision, the specific choice, made in 1938 in Nagoya to build the Zero the way it was built. That choice was not a mistake in the context of the problem it was answering. The Zero was exactly what the Navy needed in 1940 and 1941, built to exactly the standard that the constraints of its time and place permitted. The ghost is not the choice itself, but the shadow it casts forward, the way in which the excellence of the early design became, through the specific mechanism of the pilot corps' attrition and the Allied industrial response, the foundation of a later vulnerability. Excellence and vulnerability were not separate things in the Zero. They were the same thing, expressed in the same aluminium alloy, in the same lightweight structure, in the same absence of protective weight. What made it great was what made it fragile. And that tension between greatness and fragility, between the brilliance of a design and the costs embedded in that brilliance, is the thing that the Zero preserves most faithfully for the people who continue to study it. The pilots, the engineers, the ground crews, the intelligence analysts, the tactical theorists, all of them left marks on the Zero's history that are still legible. The aircraft itself, in the small number of examples that survive in museums and restoration facilities, is still carrying those marks in its structure. The decisions that Horikoshi made are visible in the dimensions and weight of every surviving airframe. The wear patterns of the controls reflect the hands that flew them. The maintenance records, where they survive, preserve the names of the men who kept the aircraft running in conditions that became progressively more difficult through the war's final years. History is not an abstraction. It is a set of specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances, preserved in documents and objects and accounts. The Zero is one of the most complete such objects that the Second World War produced, and everything it preserves is worth the careful attention it has received and will continue to receive. Chapter 18. The Long Reckoning. Every great weapon eventually becomes a question not about strategy or tactics or production numbers, but about what it meant. Not what it accomplished, in the measurable sense, but what its existence reveals about the people who built it, the people who flew it, and the people who were changed by encountering it. The Zero has been generating that kind of question since 1945, and the questions have not grown simpler with the passage of time. If anything, they have grown more interesting, more difficult to answer superficially, more resistant to the kinds of resolution that comfortable historical narrative prefers. The question of what the Zero tells us about Japanese technical capability in the 1930s and 40s has a relatively clear answer by now. It tells us that the Japanese aviation industry, by the late 1930s, was capable of producing aircraft that were genuinely world-class by any objective performance standard, and that the Western failure to recognize this before the war was a failure of perception rather than a failure of evidence. The evidence was available. Chennault had seen it. Intelligence analysts had documented fragments of it. The Zero's performance over China had been real and had been reported. The failure to act on that evidence was a specific kind of institutional failure, the failure of a system to process information that challenged its foundational assumptions, and understanding it precisely has value for any organization that wants to avoid repeating it. The question of what the Zero tells us about the relationship between engineering excellence and strategic outcome is harder. The Zero was, by the standards of its introduction, perhaps the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. It achieved results in the opening campaigns of the Pacific War that exceeded what its designers had intended or its pilots had expected. And yet the war ended in precisely the way that its strategic architects had most feared, with American industrial capacity fully mobilized, Allied forces advancing on the Japanese home islands, and Japan's military aviation reduced to a fraction of its opening campaign capability. The Zero's excellence did not produce the strategic outcome that Japanese planners required, not because the Zero failed, but because the system of which the Zero was a part had been built for a different kind of war than the one that actually unfolded. This is the lesson that the Zero teaches most clearly when it is examined honestly, not the lesson about maneuverability or range or the Thak weave or the Akuten analysis, important as all of those are, but the lesson about the relationship between a weapon and its strategic context. A weapon is not a strategy. A technically superior aircraft is not a war-winning asset if the war it is being used in has a shape that the aircraft's qualities do not fit. The Zero was supremely well fitted for the short, decisive, high-tempo offensive campaign that Japanese strategic planners had designed. When the war became long, attritional, defensive, and fought against an opponent whose industrial capacity was growing faster than Japan's could compensate for, the Zero's specific qualities, its lightness, its maneuverability, its dependency on exceptional pilots, became liabilities rather than assets. The same design that had made it perfect for one kind of war made it inadequate for another. The pilots who flew the Zero across its operational career from the pre-production aircraft over Chongqing in September of 1940 to the last sorties of 1945 represent a human range that the aircraft's legend sometimes collapses into a single heroic type. They were not a single type. They were men from specific backgrounds, with specific training histories, carrying specific personal weights into the cockpits of their aircraft on specific days. The pilots of the early campaign were different in almost every relevant dimension from the pilots of the final year. The veterans who had flown over China were different from the replacement pilots, rushed through compressed training programs. What they shared was the aircraft, the same basic design, the same engine, the same controls, and what they experienced in that aircraft was shaped as much by when they flew it and against whom as by the aircraft's own characteristics. Jiro Horikoshi died on the 11th of January, 1982, having spent the 4 decades since the war's end as a conscientious and thoughtful public figure on questions of aviation history and engineering. His memoir, published under the title Eagles of Mitsubishi, remains one of the most valuable primary sources for the Zero's technical and institutional history, precise in its technical detail, honest about the constraints under which the design was made, and engaged with the moral dimensions of wartime engineering in a way that is rare in the genre. He did not seek to escape the weight of what his creation had been used for. He carried it with the same methodical care he had applied to the original engineering problem, looking at it clearly, describing it honestly, and preserving the record for people who would need to understand it after he was gone. The long reckoning that the Zero requires is, in part, a reckoning with the specific kind of tragedy that technical excellence can produce when it operates inside a flawed strategic calculation. The Zero was not a tragic aircraft in the sense that it was poorly designed or incompetently operated. It was a tragic aircraft in the sense that it was excellent enough to make a fundamentally unsustainable strategic position appear viable for longer than it would otherwise have done, and that in doing so, it extended a war, that extended a suffering, that the aircraft's excellence alone could not prevent from ending badly. The men who built it were not responsible for the strategic calculation that deployed it. The men who flew it were not responsible for the institutional decisions that committed Japan to a war whose costs they would ultimately pay. But the aircraft carried all of it, the brilliance and the tragedy together, inseparable in the same airframe. The specific numbers that define the Zero's production and operational history deserve to be named one final time, because numbers carry their own kind of weight in a history of this kind. Across all variants and all manufacturers, more than 10,500 aircraft were produced, Mitsubishi building approximately 3,879, Nakajima building approximately 6,538, with the remainder divided among trainer and floatplane variants and other licensed producers. The aircraft flew in combat from September of 1940 to August of 1945, nearly 5 years of continuous operational service that spanned the widest oceanic theatre in the history of aerial warfare. It was, by total production numbers, the most produced Japanese aircraft of the war. It was, by the duration of its operational career, among the longest-serving fighter types in any air force of the conflict, and it was, by the breadth of its strategic impact, the degree to which its existence and performance shaped the decisions and outcomes of the opening Pacific campaigns, one of the most consequential single aircraft designs in the history of military aviation. The Zeros that remain in museums around the world are carrying all of this inside them: the specific alloy of their skin, the particular geometry of their wings, the weight distribution that Horikoshi's team calculated and recalculated across hundreds of design iterations. These things are still there, still measurable, still available to anyone with the technical knowledge to read them. They are primary sources of the most direct kind, and they are diminishing. The responsibility of preserving them, of maintaining the ability to encounter them directly, belongs to the community of people who understand what they represent, not as symbols of any ideology or any outcome, but as physical evidence of what human beings were capable of imagining and building in the middle of the most destructive conflict the world has ever seen. There will be other aircraft. There have been other aircraft. But the Zero occupies a specific place in the catalogue of human technical achievement that no subsequent design has replaced the place of the weapon that changed the terms of the contest, simply by existing, that forced its opponents to become better than they had been, simply by demonstrating what better looked like, and that carried within its elegant, lightweight structure the full complexity of the human situation that produced it. It was not a monument, it was not a symbol, it was an aircraft, precise, beautiful, dangerous, brilliant, and ultimately mortal, like everything that human hands have made and human history has used. The Pacific sky that the Zero ruled in 1941 and 1942 is the same sky that exists today above the same ocean. The carriers are gone, The pilots are gone. The great naval formations that crossed those waters in both directions are gone, but the sky remains. And somewhere in its quality of light on a clear morning over the Pacific, that specific clarity of air over open water that every pilot who has flown it remarks upon, there is still something that keeps the memory honest. Not a ghost, exactly. Something quieter than that. The trace of a decision made in Nagoya in the late 1930s, when an engineer with a difficult problem and the right tools decided that impossible was not a permanent condition, and built from that decision something that changed the world. If you have stayed with this documentary from the first chapter to the last thank you, this is the kind of history that deserves the kind of attention you have given it. If the Zero story has kept you company through the night, or given you something to think about that stays with you into the morning, then it has done what a documentary of this kind is meant to do. Subscribe if you would like to stay with this channel. There are more stories like this one ahead, long, careful, precise, and built for audiences who understand that history, told honestly, is worth every hour it takes to tell it properly.